unveiling the cloister, myth versus reality in medieval convents. Era of idealization. Imagine stepping into a medieval convent as it might appear through the lens of a 13th century novice's devotion. In this era, convents were publicized as sanctuaries of prayer and learning, almost miniature utopias of piety where women renounced the world to serve God. Walls rose high, cloaks fell evenly, and the chant of the divine office echoed through stone corridors. For the laity, these enclosed communities embodied the promise of spiritual purity, a world completely detached from the noise, temptation, and turmoil of secular life. Parents who sent daughters to the convent did so believing they were offering them a path to holiness, education, and righteous purpose. In contemporary retellings, whether in stained glass, illuminated manuscripts, or the pages of later hagiographies, nuns are portrayed as paragons of virtue, their every action reflecting unwavering devotion. Era of hidden realities. Now transport yourself just a few decades or centuries later to the same convent, but look beyond the public facade. In this period, while the choir still rang with hymns at dawn and sacred manuscripts lined the shelves, cloaked beneath the surface were whispered accounts of secret romances and convent intrigues. Church records from bishops' visitations reveal unexpected visitors slipping through the back gate at night. Chamber pots concealed in corners tell silent stories of nuns who found themselves with unexpected pregnancies. Letters written in Latin code, burnished with the promise of forbidden affection, were hidden inside loaves of bread meant for the poor. And in kitchens where hearty loaves and thin gruel once symbolized discipline, there were midnight feasts, smuggled cheeses, rich meats, and wine relabeled as consecrated vinegar. The world that once seemed so pristine had become, behind closed doors, a complex tapestry of desire and human imperfection. At the heart of these lies a single dilemma: how does a community founded on vows of chastity, obedience, and poverty reconcile the natural human impulses of its members? On one hand, there was the ideal, women consecrated entirely to spiritual pursuits. On the other, there was the reality, nuns who, despite their vows, were still flesh and blood. They felt longing, experienced heartbreak, and wrestled with ambition. The tension between the era of idealization and the era of hidden realities created a living contradiction, a solemn institution built on strict roles, yet composed of individuals whose personal needs and emotions could not be wholly suppressed. This dilemma also reflected broader questions about institutional power, family dynamics, and social expectations. Was it better to enforce rigorous discipline or to acknowledge the humanity of each woman within those walls? Era of founding and rule writing. When the first convents began to emerge in Western Europe, often linked to the rise of the Benedictine and Cistercian reforms, founders like Saint Benedict and Saint Clare sought to establish communities governed by clear rules. These rules spelled out precise schedules of prayer, modest clothing, limited contact with the outside world, and a vow of complete chastity. In places like the Abbey of Chartres in France, established c. 549, or the Poor Clare Convent of Assisi, founded 1212, the emphasis was on strict enclosure. Novices entered after careful vetting, often bringing a dowry or being otherwise financially supported by their families, with the understanding that they would embrace a life of contemplation. Their daily rituals, matins at midnight, lauds at dawn, and so on, created a rhythm that, in theory, left no space for sin. The walls of these early convents were deliberately high, designed to protect nuns from worldly temptations and the interference of local lords. Era of institutional complexity and lay influence. By the 14th and 15th centuries, however, many of these convents had become deeply intertwined with local politics and family ambitions. Wealthy families, for instance, often sent younger daughters to convents not solely for religious reasons but to manage inheritance disputes or to position family members in a sphere of prestige and influence. In certain well-endowed institutions like Fontevraud Abbey in France, abbesses came from noble lines and wielded considerable secular power over land holdings and local serfs. Moreover, some convents relaxed their roles in practice, turning into noble boarding schools where daughters of the gentry cultivated social connections. Lay patrons funded expansions of church properties, donated relics, sometimes dubious, and intervened whenever papal or episcopal directives threatened to curtail a convent's autonomy. Thus, while the rulebook may still insist on strict enclosure, the actual daily life of the institution became more complex, influenced by manners, legal charters, and financial endowments, creating an environment where the original spiritual ideal coexisted uneasily with worldly concerns. When does spiritual devotion give way to human politics? This question underscored the shifting purpose of many medieval convents. A woman entering a convent expected a life dedicated to prayer, accepting a new identity that renounced her family's name, possessions, and worldly ambitions. Yet over time, convents also became repositories of inherited wealth and social status. The challenge was that these dual roles, spiritual sanctuary versus socio-political institution, were often at odds. Abbesses, once chosen purely for their devotion and wisdom, sometimes found themselves acting more like feudal lords, negotiating land leases or adjudicating disputes among tenants. The dilemma forced every nun, and especially those in leadership, to navigate the fine line between maintaining religious integrity and managing earthly affairs. How could one uphold vows of humility and poverty while presiding over a sprawling estate and negotiating with powerful local merchants? Era of spiritual aspirations and daily discipline. Step into the cloister in the early morning, circa 1300. A novice named Eleanor wakes at midnight for matins. Her boots press softly against the stone floor as lanterns carry her between cells. There is no room for hesitation or distraction. By candlelight, she sings the psalms, her voice echoing alongside the older sisters who have memorized the divine office in Latin and Old French. By dawn, she has finished her prayers, donned a simple habit, and made her way to the workroom to weave cloth or mill grain. Her life is regimented: 6 hours of prayer, 4 hours of manual labor, and brief periods for studying scripture or copying manuscripts. She eats unsalted porridge and drink water that has been blessed as holy. The role is absolute: no personal letters, no excess warmth in clothing, no contact with men except the chaplain behind the grill. In this era, each moment is designed to detach the soul from bodily desires. The piety of each nun is measured by her willingness to surrender personal comfort. Era of human impulses and hidden yearnings. Fast forward 50 years, or even just 5, from that picture-perfect discipline. Now imagine Sister Isabella leaving her cell at dawn to copy a prayer book, her eyes catching a glimpse of Brother Thomas, the monastery's confessor. His voice, though muffled by the bridal grill, sounds warm and comforting. She tells herself that her longing is spiritual in nature, a nudge toward divine union. Yet in the privacy of her cell, her cool shakes as she pens a letter in Latin verse, an ode to his chalice of devotion, which, in code, addresses her affection for the man behind the grill. Meanwhile, Sister Margaret, living in the same convent, has begun slipping scraps of delicious cheese, brought in secretly by a gardener, under her habit to share with her friends at midnight. They huddle together in the warming oven, whispering stories of distant families and long-ago courtly love, passing a small wooden box of salted meat like a forbidden treasure. In this era, the strict schedule remains, but the cloister's walls have become porous, vulnerable to the pull of human emotion. Each nun, while motivated by devotion, is also navigating curiosity, friendship, and, at times, intense romance. The structure is still there, but underneath lies a tangle of desires that the rulebook never fully anticipated. Can vows of perfection withstand the frailty of the human heart? In the era of spiritual aspirations, a vow of chastity seemed unbreakable, a path to holiness. Yet as convents grew wealthier and as individual nuns confronted their own longing, that vow morphed into a tightrope. On one side stood an idealized vision of divine marriage, of the soul's complete focus on Christ. On the other side stood laughter in hidden kitchens, stolen glances at a handsome confessor, and secret letters coded in classical Latin. Some nuns navigated this tension by reinterpreting their affection as purely spiritual, arguing that affection without intent did not violate the rule. Others openly challenged the idea of absolute enclosure, claiming that such strict separation impoverished one's spiritual life rather than enriched it. The dilemma fractured the community. One sister might admonish another for an illicit liaison, while a third prayed for mercy, both sisters believing themselves entirely loyal to God. Within these contradictory impulses lay a single truth: human beings, no matter how devout, carry the weight of their hearts. In many cases, the cloister's unyielding structure became the very thing that drove some nuns toward more creative and sometimes dangerous expressions of their passions. Vows under scrutiny, daily life, roles, and rebellion. Era of rigid roles and monastic discipline. Imagine walking through a well-worn gateway into a 12th century Benedictine convent in northern France. The air is cool and damp, sunlight filters through narrow windows, and the hush of prayer drapes over every service. Inside, a new novice named Matilda finds herself thrust into an environment governed by a detailed rulebook, the rule of Saint Benedict, that dictates every moment of her day. She is handed a simple habit, given basic instructions on prayer times, and must memorize passages in Latin. The altar bells toll at midnight for vigils, rousing her from a deep slumber. By 1 a.m. she stands with her fellow nuns, singing psalms by candlelight. After a brief rest following lauds at dawn, she spends several hours working in the scriptorium, meticulously copying illuminated manuscripts. For midday meal, thin porridge and a small piece of fish greets her at the refectory where silence is strictly enforced. Conversation is replaced by reading aloud from sacred texts. The afternoons are devoted to manual labor, tending the herb garden, weaving cloaks, or milling grain that fosters humility and obedience. As evening approaches, the nuns return to the church for vespers and compline, their voices forming a sacred chorus. Throughout this era, any deviation, speaking out of turn, failing to show up for a prayer hour, or disobeying an abbess's directive is seen as a serious breach of discipline. Punishments range from extra prayers in the cloister to being temporarily confined to one cell. The convent exists as a self-contained world where the rule is law and every member is expected to submit without question. Era of personal agency and quiet rebellion. Fast forward to the early 15th century and that same convent, though still cloistered behind high stone walls, has begun to harbor subtle undercurrents of resistance. Although the role of Saint Benedict remains unchanged on paper, its application has grown uneven. New abbesses, often drawn from noble families, sometimes grant dispensations that allow sisters to receive letters from home or adopt slightly richer meals during feast days. One afternoon, Sister Beatrice recalls the story of Sister Agnes, who, upon being told that any faltering in her vow required penance, quietly replied, "My heart stumbles when no one sees, I choose penance in silence." Beatrice's words hint at the concession that some nuns found creative ways to navigate the rule: contraband herbs in the garden to soothe a child's fever, or a handwritten poem passed under the grill to a beloved confessor. Instead of strict separation, small social gatherings emerge, an occasional communal reading in French, a shared pot of sweetened wine on the day before Lent. The memory of itinerant patrons bringing lavish donations has encouraged some within the convent to push back against austerity. They begin to request more comfortable habits or private choirs to entertain visiting dignitaries. The role remains the same, but in practice, convent life becomes a spectrum. Some sisters cling rigidly to the text, while others carve out modest allowances that honor personal needs. The contrast between Matilda's era of absolute conformity and Beatrice's era of nuanced negotiation reveals how a community that once prided itself on total obedience learned to adapt, often quietly, to the human realities of ambition, comfort, and personal devotion. At the intersection of those lies the question: how do individuals balance devotion to a strict, communal role with personal needs for autonomy and compassion? In the earlier era, the rulebook offered clarity. Every day was an exercise of obedience. The convent's unity derived from uniformity. Yet such discipline left little room for personal struggles, illness, family tragedies, or moments of spiritual doubt. By the later era, concessions like private medical care or discreet communication with family provided relief but also challenged the very purpose of vows. A sister who smuggles a small broth of chicken stock to ease a fellow nun's fever wrestles with obedience on one hand and compassion on the other. Should she risk censure or remain silent while her sister weakens? Both eras reveal that the most devout lives still contain lived realities that cannot be wholly suppressed: frailty of the body, shifts in leadership, and the changing expectations of lay patrons. That dilemma, preserving the collective sanctity of the cloister while nurturing individual well-being, becomes a subtle but persistent tension. Era of uniform enforcement and canonical oversight. In the late 13th century, the church hierarchy maintained a tight grip on monastic institutions. Bishops were required to conduct visitations every few years, ensuring that abbesses and prioresses complied with canonical law. At such visitations, a bishop's examiner might question the abbess on the enforcement of fasting days, inspect the novice's habit quality, and verify whether the rule of Saint Benedict was read aloud every chapter, even in midwinter when frost bit at bare feet. For example, at a 1283 visitation of a Cistercian convent in northern England, a bishop's report records a series of infractions: sisters missing matins, a novice caught wearing lavish embroidery on her scapular, and a cook found hiding salted pork for her secret meals. The bishop decreed immediate corrections and imposed communal penances: 3 days of fasting with only bread and water, public readings of the roll to remind the sisters of their obligations, and a 1-month ban on receiving new sewing materials. These strict visitations exemplified the era's approach: uniform enforcement, public penance, and swift correction intended to maintain absolute adherence. Deviance was met with collective remedies: reciting the roll in public, stricter fasting, or exile to another convent. Era of informal allowances and pragmatic adaptations. By the mid-15th century, however, a combination of factors, economic pressures, changing social norms, and the rise of mendicant orders influenced a more pragmatic approach to role enforcement. A bishop arriving to inspect the same content might find a carefully orchestrated charade. At first glance, the choir stalls appear orderly, habits freshly mended, and the spiritual diaries, known as chronicles, glow with devotion. But behind the scenes, corners were cut. The bursar had discreetly used convent funds to pay a lay physician to care for elderly sisters, bypassing strict prohibitions on worldly medicines. The abbess, having grown accustomed to higher status through aristocratic connections, interceded with the bishop's secretary to minimize sanctions. When the bishop asked about the frequency of communal fasts, he was shown a ledger indicating compliance. Meanwhile, some sisters slipped away after curfew to collect herbs from the nearby wood. Within a single generation, camps formed, some nuns advocating greater charitable outreach, others insisting on preserving austerity. Instead of a swift communal penance, the bishop's final report, signed in 1462, recommended balancing piety with prudence, a single fast day each week instead of two, permission for midwives to attend pregnant women. Even though pregnant women violated the vow of chastity, and allowances for a modest stipend for the abbey's infirm sisters. This era's pragmatic adaptations reflected a tacit acknowledgement that rigid role enforcement could undermine a convent's sustainability. The expanded allowances and unspoken compromises illustrated a shift from uniform correction to negotiated tolerance. To what extent does flexibility weaken communal discipline, and at what point does rigidness harm individual well-being? In the earlier era, strict episcopal oversight maintained conformity but sometimes produced unspoken resentment. Novices felt fear rather than devotion, and older sisters concealed infractions rather than admit vulnerability. In the later era, concessions like medical care or reduced fasting introduced compassion but also fostered potential laxity. What began as a minor leniency could gradually erode the sense of shared sacrifice that bound the community. The dilemma when keeping a role threatens life and health versus when bending a role risks dissolving communal identity resonated at every level, from individual sisters to abbesses negotiating with local bishops, down to lay patrons who sometimes urged relaxation of certain roles in light of broader economic or family needs. Era of enclosure and the expectation of total separation. Under the rule of St. Clare, founded 1212 and later reinforced by papal bulls, many nunneries adopted an ethos of strict enclosure: no windows that opened to the street, no direct conversation with visitors except through a grill, and no personal possessions beyond what was absolutely necessary. In convents following the Franciscan pattern, poor in both resources and clothing, novices surrendered any personal dowry and relied entirely on alms. The ideal, a sister's identity existed only within the convent's walls. Her purpose was spiritual intercession, not worldly engagement. This meant that even letters from home required approval by the abbess, who screened them for doctrinal correctness. A 1305 decree from Pope Benedict XI mandated that if any nun left the cloister walls without explicit permission, she was subject to expulsion. In effect, the rulebook created a sealed environment in which every sister's behavior was expected to align with a collective standard of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Era of corroded enclosure and selective engagement. By the 16th century, broader societal changes, including the rise of humanism, the influx of Renaissance art and literature, and increased interaction with urban centers, chipped away at the notion of total separation. In some influential convents, windows were enlarged to improve light for manuscript copying. A few allowed lay sisters to tend small gardens along the perimeter walls, where merchants could deliver produce in exchange for small donations. In a notable example from 1521, the abbess of a Dominican convent in Florence petitioned the bishop for permission to admit university-educated novices who could correspond with scholars beyond the city. She argued that such engagement would enrich the convent's intellectual life and foster charitable networks. The bishop granted conditional approval, stipulating that letters be read by a senior nun before entering the cloister. In another instance, a Cistercian house in England, strapped for funds during the 1530s Reformation upheavals, began renting a small parcel of land to a local tradesman in exchange for monetary support. On feast days, that tradesman was allowed to hear Mass in the outer chapel and distribute food to the poor. The narrowing of enclosure rules reflected a shift. Convents no longer functioned as isolated fortresses of asceticism but as nuanced participants in urban economies and scholarly exchanges. Sisters began to cultivate connections discreet enough to keep up appearances but pragmatic enough to ensure survival and relevance. Is it better to maintain perfect isolation and risk irrelevance, or to interact with the world at the risk of diluting your spiritual identity? In the era of hermetic enclosure, the content's purity was unquestioned, but its influence outside the cloister was minimal. Novices like Gertrude found sanctity in silence but wondered how they could help the indigent poor when their fences barred them from city streets. In the era of selective engagement, sisters could balance the convent's financial exigencies by selling medicinal herbs or giving sanctuary to destitute women, yet they also faced moral hazards. Was it still holy to trade with merchants? Or did such commerce compromise their vow of poverty? The convent leadership had to decide whether to uphold absolute separation at the cost of dwindling resources or to allow pragmatic exceptions that risked turning sacred space into a socio-economic hub. Although the role remained unchanged, no leaving the cloister unescorted, the era of pragmatic adaptation redefined what compliance looked like, forcing each abbess to navigate a tightrope between spiritual integrity and institutional survival. Forbidden passions, secret romances, pregnancies, and cover UPS. Era of absolute chastity and spiritual ideal. Close your eyes and imagine a medieval convent perched on a gentle hill in 13th century France. The stone walls stand tall, their gray surface warmed by afternoon sun. Inside, Sister Eleanor has taken her vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience just a month ago. Each morning, she emerges from her narrow cell at dawn to chant matins in the dimly lit chapel. The role is clear: once clothed in the habit, she leaves behind her past, family ties, wealth, and any hope of worldly romance. In theory, the convent exists to sanctify the soul through separation from all earthly desires. Sisters swear to treat Christ as their one true spouse. Romantic affections are strictly forbidden. In this era, the abbess reminds novices that any hint of passion threatens not only personal salvation but the safety of the entire community. The monastery's reputation rests on its strict adherence to the rule of Saint Benedict, on scriptural obedience, simple meals of porridge and bread, and evenings spent in silent meditation. Even a fleeting thought of love is deemed a form of temptation, something to be immediately confessed and repented. This era's ideal, unwavering devotion casts all emotion into the realm of sin. Under the watchful eyes of prioresses and vigilant lay sisters, every moment is a test of commitment. Era of hidden yearnings and human complexity. Now shift forward a century to the same convent, still tucked away among rolling hills, but changed by time and circumstance. In the afternoon sunlight, Sister Beatrice, a young nun, feels a flutter in her heart each time she passes the confessor's grill. It is no longer enough to live only for God. Her human heart, alive with curiosity and longing, seeks more. Neighbors whisper of secret meetings in the orchard, late at night, where lamplight glints off cloaks. In hushed tones, sisters pass coded messages written in Latin verse, promises that our souls entwine more surely than vows penned in ink. These clandestine romances emerge behind closed doors. One sister conceals a letter hidden in a loaf of bread, another slips out to meet a traveling troubadour masquerading as a pilgrim. Meanwhile, the abbess begins to suspect that her community's strict rules cannot fully contain human desire. The era's reality reveals that chastity vows, though well-intended, cannot entirely restrain natural impulses. Pregnancies, no longer hypothetical, surface in whispered rumors. A novice awakens one morning with a subtly rounded belly that no habit can disguise. When a visiting bishop arrives to inspect the convent's compliance with canonical law, the abbess begs him to handle the delicate matter quietly, hoping his compassion will outweigh ecclesiastical severity. In this reality, each woman's choice to follow or bypass the rules becomes an act of courage or desperation, influenced by love, fear, and sometimes even coercion. Between these lies a pressing question: how do vows of absolute chastity coexist with the natural yearnings of the heart? In the first era, the vow offered clear guidance. The soul's fidelity to God demanded complete renunciation of romantic love. But in the second era, the lived experience of sisters like Beatrice and her fellow nuns revealed that human emotion could not be fully extinguished. A confession to Christ was not enough to silence the pulse of desire. The dilemma arises when the role, originally a shield of spiritual integrity, becomes a barrier to empathy and understanding. For a sister discovering unexpected affection, the choice is agonizing. Should she confess her feelings and risk public penance, or keep silent and navigate secret passages to meet her beloved? For the abbess, the dilemma is equally profound: enforce the role to preserve the convent's sanctity, yet risk driving sisters into hidden transgressions, or turn a blind eye and threaten the convent's reputation and standing within the church. In a world that demanded unwavering devotion, the conflict between duty and desire tested the bonds of sisterhood at every turn. Era of rigid enforcement and public scandal. In 1324, within a Cistercian convent in Burgundy, a scandal erupted that captured the attention of local townsfolk and church authorities alike. Sister Matilda, known for her exemplary piety, was suddenly at the center of accusations. Her habit no longer concealed a burgeoning pregnancy. Word spread like wildfire when a lay sister discovered an enchanted ring in Matilda's cell, an alleged symbol of her secret betrothal to a traveling nobleman. According to the bishop's visitation record, Matilda insisted that her condition was a miraculous conception, citing the Virgin Mary's example. But such defenses were met with deep suspicion. A bishop's decree ordered Matilda to leave the convent immediately. She was to be escorted to a remote hermitage, strictly forbidden further contact with fellow nuns. The abbess stood by, citing the role's directive: if a sister is found pregnant, she shall be removed from the community and kept in a place of penance until she gives birth. The baby's fate was grim. Whispers circulated that the infant was taken to a local hospital of St. Mary to be cared for, but the convent's records remained silent. Within days, letters from Matilda's family pleaded for mercy, arguing that the father was a distant cousin in a powerful county. Yet the church's response was swift: a public penance required before the entire community, and exile until the baby's christening day. As Matilda left the cloister in tears, other sisters wondered how one of their own, until recently the very model of sanctity, could fall so far. Era of covert compromise and partial clemency. Jump forward to 1427, in a Benedictine convent somewhere in England. Despite papal decrees still condemning any sexual activity, the abbess has grown accustomed to navigating the complex world of local patronage and royal favor. When Sister Anne, a beloved nun gifted with a sweet voice, falls pregnant, the abbess opts for a different approach. Rather than expose Anne to public shame, she arranges for a discreet relocation to a neighboring convent that specializes in providing care for sickly and elderly nuns. There, Anne is known simply as Sister Margaret, allowing her to hide in plain sight. The abbess covers up Anne's nighttime wanderings to the infirmary by telling the visitation record she is suffering from consumption. When Anne gives birth, the baby is quietly baptized by special dispensation, but then raised by a sympathetic local widow who cares for an abandoned child found near the convent gates. The official convent annals never mentioned, and again, the abbess's ledger simply notes an unexpected medical retreat and a stipend for a midwife. Though this approach bends, but does not break, the letter of the role, it demonstrates a pragmatic willingness to balance compassion with church discipline. The community loans a small sum to Anne's family for the baby's upbringing, and later, Sister Anne returns to a less structured part of the cloister where she undertakes menial tasks far from the choir stalls. The convent's reputation remains intact: no bishop's inquisition, no public disgrace, yet the sisters are well aware that their charged hush is sustained only by selective silence and shared empathy. Here, the question resurfaces: how far can mercy stretch before it unravels the very fabric of communal discipline? In Matilda's era, the answer was simple: public penance and exile reaffirmed the role's authority, yet inflicted deep wounds on both the individual and the community's conscience. By Anne's time, the abbess recognized that compassion sometimes demanded bending roles, but she encountered a paradox: greater kindness, but at the cost of eroding transparency. When compassion replaces punishment, the convent gains peace at the expense of absolute accountability. Sisters like Beatrice and Eleanor read between the lines: mercy can feel like favoritism, especially when privileges are reserved for those with influential patrons. The abbess's choice to conceal Anne's pregnancy spared her public shame, but it also created an environment of whispered rumors and hidden debts. The dilemma lies in balancing the community's spiritual integrity against the humanity of its members, an ever-present tension that shapes decisions, deepens bonds, and tests leadership. Ink, herbs, and escapes, love letters, abortive concoctions, and flight. Era of coated quills and humble herb gardens, 13th to 14th centuries. Picture a quiet Benedictine convent in northern Italy, circa 1300. The morning sun filters through narrow windows, illuminating dust motes dancing above rows of silent sisters at prayer. Hidden beneath these quiet rhythms, a young nun named Cecilia carries a simple quill to her cell each evening. Her heart alive with longing for Brother Thomas, the reading chaplain, finds release through coded love letters. In this era, quills and wax seals were precious commodities. A letter slipped under the wooden grill of the infirmary door at midnight might carry a phrase like, "My soul blooms only when your voice guides my prayers." To the untrained eye, it reads as pious devotion to Cecilia's secret beloved. It speaks of longing and promise. Yet quills were not the only tool in her arsenal. Outside, the convent's modest herb garden flourishes under the care of the infirmarian sister who cultivates pennyroyal, rue, tansy, and mugwort, plants valued for soothing teas and poultices. Though officially labeled medicinal, these herbs carry whispered reputations for more clandestine uses. Younger sisters hear tales of Sister Hildegard of Trier, an apothecary sister known for discreetly providing tinctures that could delay menstruation. In a time when pregnancy within the cloister was unthinkable, rumor has it that her concoctions, when boiled just so, could quietly restore irregular cycles. Though most sisters use the garden only to treat minor ailments, a trusting novice might approach Sister Hildegard's window for a small envelope of dried rue, labeled as tea for nervous humors, but in practice a potential abortifacient. Escape in this era takes equally humble forms. A sheet knotted to the windowsill allows Sister Beatrix to climb down to a hidden glade where she meets a traveling merchant. In some cases, the convent's outer walls hold secret alcoves, small, narrow passages designed originally for drainage but repurposed by daring sisters as escape routes. When the night is moonless, a novice might slip through these winding tunnels, emerging on the far side of the abbey orchard to join a forbidden rendezvous. One recorded example from 1347 tells of Sister Emilia who dressed in her novice's habit but with a pilgrim's staff tucked under her cloak. In the darkness, she crossed the common fields to join her lover in a nearby village, returning before dawn with hay in her shoes, her only sign of an absence that the abbess officially chalked up to a brief pilgrimage for saintly inspiration. Era of elaborate subterfuge and calculated departures, 15th to 16th centuries. Several generations later, convents have grown wealthier and abbesses have more influence. In a Cistercian nunnery in Burgundy, circa 1485, things look even quieter on the surface. But beneath the facade, sisters wield more sophisticated methods of clandestine communication, tiny, folded strips of parchment, known as bilums, that slip between bound manuscripts or are hidden in the hollowed base of a wooden crucifix. One nun, Sister Lawrence, once smuggled an entire poem in Latin that began, Dulcis ignis cordis mei, tucking it into the stitching of the choir robe. The letter's final verse, which reads, "Come, my love, beneath the moon's lament," was passed to a young knight through an unsuspecting lay sister carrying alms for the poor. Meanwhile, the convent's herbal repertoire has expanded. In addition to pennyroyal and rue, records now show that sisters cultivate black cohosh, tansy, and even trace amounts of thorn apples, plants used to induce labor or terminate pregnancies. Sister Heloise of Notre Dame, a documented herbalist, maintained a ledger of herbs reserved for serious women's woes, listing quantities enough to aid not just the convent's members but also aristocratic clients. One well-known case from 1523 involved a young nun who discovered her unexpected pregnancy after falling ill. The abbess discreetly provided her a tincture of pennyroyal and tansy, accompanied by iron tonic to balance the humors. The local bishop, unaware of these hidden remedies, simply noted in his visitation report that Sister Agnes, now in better health, had suffered a mysterious ailment and recovered gracefully. Escape tactics have become bolder as well. By the late 15th century, the convent's knowledge of local politics affords certain sisters access to maps of secret troop movements. One case from 1492 recounts Sister Clementia disguising herself as a young novice from a nearby abbey, complete with falsified travel documents, boarding a vegetable cart bound for Lyon. She succeeded in evading 2 sentries by refusing to dismount. Her driver, a sympathetic former gardener, feigned ignorance when asked if he carried any cloistered women. It wasn't until midday that the chef in Lyon's largest inn recognized her from a local chapbook illustration, yet by then, Clementia was already on a riverboat bound for Geneva, her habit hidden beneath the merchant's cloak. At the crossroads of these lies a pivotal question: when does ingenuity in the name of love, health, or freedom become a breach of trust that erodes the very foundations of communal life? In the earlier era, sisters like Cecilia and Beatrix relied on simple codes and small doses of herbal remedy, all under the constant threat of severe punishment. Yet their actions, though clandestine, were born of natural passion and basic medical needs. In the later era, nuns accessed more potent abortives and used forged documents to orchestrate full escapes that could leave the abbess and the entire convent at risk of scandal. The dilemma hinges on whether these acts of subversion are heroic assertions of personal agency or dangerous betrayals that undermine trust among sisters. In an environment where every action is recorded in annals and judged by both God and the local bishop, each coded letter or hidden tincture is a gamble with both spiritual and temporal consequences. Era of whispered verses and garden remedies, 13th to 14th centuries. In a small Benedictine convent in Provence around 1350, Sister Marguerite experiences the ache of separation the moment Brother Jean's voice drifts through the grill each Sunday. The convent's choir screen offers glimpses of his tunic but never his face. Marguerite's heart yearns, so she writes slim vellum strips that say, Tua nomine vivo, tua amore morier, in your name I live, in your love I die, sealing each missive with a drop of beeswax and smudged letter of M for anonymity. She hides the letter inside a loaf meant for the neighboring monastery's poor, relying on Brother Jean's passing monk to retrieve it. These early coded messages, though innocent compared to later machinery, carry immense risk. Any interception could result in corporal penance or exile. In the same decade, the convent's herbalist, Sister Hildegard, quietly experiments with simple herbal infusions. One day, a novice approaches her in clandestine tears, revealing a fear. She has missed her monthly cycle, and the dread of disgrace looms. Hildegard dispenses a small sachet of rue and pennyroyal, instructing the novice to steep it overnight in a cup of water, then to strain and drink. She explains, her tone hushed, that the tea will restore balance to the womb. Within days, the novice's cycle resumes, her secret intact. Meanwhile, in the convent's outer orchard, a thin tunnel originally used for runoff now serves as the only escape route. Sister Jean, accused of stealing bread to feed the poor, slips into the tunnel at dusk and emerges at the village square, where villagers greet her with hastily borrowed clothing. She spends the night at a sympathetic villager's barn, returning before dawn with hay strewn in her shoes. When questioned by the abbess, she feigns ignorance. I dreamed of my father's farm. Era of forged passports and lethal potions, 15th to 16th centuries. By 1480, convents in northern France have developed more elaborate clandestine methods. Sister Lucienne, a gifted calligrapher, crafts a passport bearing the hallmarks of a local lord's seal, granting safe passage to any woman accompanying Mother Superior. In reality, this document was a forgery, Lucienne's skills turning parchment into a convincing shield. When she and Sister Isabel step onto a horse-drawn cart leaving the abbey gate at dawn, local guards glance at their credentials and, nodding, wave them through. They spend 3 days in a nearby town under assumed names, Marie, and securing new habits that conceal their true identities. By journey's end, Isabel has joined her lover in another province. Lucienne returns under cover of darkness, planting her forged passport back in the convent's archives as if nothing transpired. The Garda's herb beds have also evolved. Records from 1512 tell of Sister Marjorie, under the tutelage of Sister Heloise, now the convent's esteemed apothecary, stepping into a small greenhouse built to house temperate herbs. There, behind closed lattice doors, they crush leaves of black cohosh, fold them into crystal vials of wine, and carefully label them for feverish palpitations. In a matter of days, Sister Marjorie's secret case of fever is resolved, and her pregnancy, believed to be inevitable, simply never comes to light. Meanwhile, word of these potent mixtures circulates among local midwives. One midwife, Marion, travels 5 miles to pay a small fee in exchange for rue and pennyroyal, blending them with a tincture of mugwort to offer discreet services to women from noble families. The convent's modest herb garden, once limited to healing poultices, has thus become a discreet hub of reproductive autonomy. The era's escape stories grow more daring. In 1538, Sister Felicia, driven by the desire to return home after hearing of her sister's grave illness, plans an elaborate flight. She instructs a trusted blacksmith to fashion a slender iron file disguised as a candle snuffer. Late one night, she uses it to carve a notch into her cell's wooden shutter. When the iron rust shows through, she smears soot and rebinds the shutter, creating the impression of candle burns. By the following week, the latch is worn thin, allowing her to slip out at dusk. She then dons a tattered cloak, douses herself in the water of a nearby spring to remove any scent, and boards a merchant's wagon bound for Bordeaux. Weeks later, letters confirm she is caring for her convalescent sister far from the abbey's stone walls. To the abbess's inquiry, Felicia's cell is simply found ajar, with no sign of how she left. The actions of those converge on a familiar tension. When does secrecy become salvation, and when does it cross the line into betrayal of vows? In the earlier period, sisters like Cecilia and Jean risked minor penance or the ire of the abbess to preserve their passions or alleviate suffering. Their clandestine letters and simple herbal teas functioned as sparks of humanity within an austere environment. Yet in the later period, more sophisticated forgeries and potent abortive potions introduced stakes that could bring ruin to the entire community if discovered. As the convent's walls grew thicker and authority structures more invested in reputation, each covert act, no matter how compassionate, carried the potential to unravel communal trust. The dilemma this asks, is the individual's right to love and survive more urgent than collective duty to avow? For Abbess Catherine in 1539, agreeing to hide Marjorie's tinctures saves one sister's life but invites a potential inquisition that could close the convent forever. For sisters in any era, balancing personal agency against sacred obligations became a question with no easy answers. Era of veiled motives and silent alliances, 13th to 14th centuries. In a remote Benedictine abbey carved into the Welsh hills circa 1365, stories echo of Sister Imogen who used coded candlelight signals from a second-floor window to guide her lover, a traveling bard, to a hidden path in the forest below. The couple's rendezvous was sustained not through forged documents but by shared knowledge of the abbey's routines. Imogen's bell for Compline sounded an extra clang when all was clear. Meanwhile, the infirmary's cruciform window, meant only for care of the ailing, became a nexus for exchanging small pouches of black cohosh, a plant known to induce early labor. Despite knowing the risk of excommunication, docile sisters in the infirmary turned a blind eye, offering Sister Helena a poultice labeled for muscle cramps, but in reality a whispered promise of discreet relief. In remote corners of the cloister, tunnels, once thought to be for water, were repurposed into secret paths. In 1392, Sister Margaret, wanted by her family to secure a lucrative marriage, escaped under cover of a storm by crawling through a narrow drain pipe. Legend holds that she emerged near the stables at dawn, hoofprints in the mud her only betrayals. She never returned. Instead, she wed a knight and later funded the convent's new chapel with a sizable dowry, and eventual reconciliation bridging betrayal and generosity. In this era, individual acts, seemingly small, rippled outward. Coded letters inspired others to take similar risks, and herbal remedies introduced by horticultural sisters quietly spread among local villagers, forging alliances between convents and townspeople. Era of courtly covers and judicial leniency, 15th to 16th centuries. By 1518, convents across Europe had become more intimately tied to noble families and local authorities. In a renowned Dominican convent in the Low Countries, Sister Johanna, the granddaughter of a duke, used her familial connections to secure a partial pardon after a foiled attempt at abortion. The convent's prioress negotiated with a sympathetic magistrate who ordered Sister Johanna to perform penance, kneeling on rushes for 3 days rather than face harsher exile. In gratitude, Johanna provided funds to build a small gazebo in the cloister garden constructed with columns inscribed Per Misericordiam, by mercy, a permanent reminder of both her misstep and the abbey's willingness to bend rules. In 1543, records from a Cistercian abbey in Spain described Sister Beatrice's escape from an arranged marriage. Disguised as a sick pilgrim, she rode a mule to Gibraltar. Her escape was facilitated by the abbess's pragmatic reuse of a forged certificate of penance that declared Beatrice had taken part in a mystical revelation, thereby necessitating temporary removal for spiritual renewal. Scouts found the certified note convincing, and she passed through town gates unchallenged. Within 2 months, she joined a small hermitage community in Lisbon, dedicating herself to a life of solitude. Meanwhile, back in the abbey, the abbess's willingness to provide forged papers and turn a blind eye to herbal remedies, now more advanced, including chloroform-like soporifics, reflected a growing pattern. Convents had to navigate not only spiritual obligations but also political alliances and legal pressures. In both eras, we revisit that central tension. When does the ingenuity meant to preserve human dignity endanger the very institution that sustains it? For Sister Imogen, sending coded signals in 1365 offered a brief taste of freedom but risked loss of status, likely sanctions, and possible closure of her abbey. For Sister Johanna in 1518, her noble status and network offered immunity that an ordinary nun would never enjoy, raising uncomfortable questions of fairness. As convents became entwined with secular courts and noble oversight, the moral calculus shifted. Protecting one sister might obligate the convent to circumvent ecclesiastical law, risking a bishop's inquiry that could lead to confiscated land. The dilemma thus crystallizes: does preserving individual autonomy justify subverting communal trust and canonical order? In each case, the convent stood at a crossroads: uphold rule at the cost of a sister's well-being, or uphold compassion at the risk of institutional survival. Power plays and penance, convent-turned brothels, trials, and forged relics. Era of strict asceticism and ecclesiastical oversight, 14th to 15th centuries. Imagine entering a 14th century Augustinian convent in Italy, its stone walls echoing with solemn hymns. The prioress oversees a strictly ascetic lifestyle, minimal food, simple habits, and vigilant prayer. Monastic cells are sparsely furnished. Any luxury is swiftly condemned as temptation. Here, the idea of a convent-turned brothel would have been unthinkable, a monstrous corruption of sacred space. Similarly, relics, fragments of saints' bones, or shards of the true cross are regarded with reverence. The prioress meticulously catalogues each relic, records its provenance, and ensures that pilgrims come for genuine veneration, not commerce. Forging a relic or using the convent's sacred reputation for personal gain would be heresy, punishable by excommunication or worse. Trials of misbehaving sisters are rare but public. Should a nun fall pregnant, she faces immediate removal to a penitent house where she endures harsh penance both for perceived moral failure and for sullying the convent's name. If a priest is found complicit in a sexual affair with a sister, the local bishop convenes a formal inquiry, testimonies are recorded, and sentences range from forced penance to exile. Such trials affirm the Church's commitment to spiritual purity and its strict hierarchy. Yet, beneath this rigid moral code, the human stories persist. Sisters like Juliana, rumored to have been rescued from poverty by a wealthy patron, quietly maintain connections with local lords. A low-ranking cleric, Father Pietro, arrives weekly to hear confessions but is rumored to linger too long behind the grill. Though no formal charges arise, whispers of secret indulgences ripple through the community. Even in this era of strict oversight, the seeds of compromise, whether born of necessity, ambition, or patronage, begin to take root. Era of opportunistic entrepreneurship and Vatican ambiguity, 16th to 17th centuries. Fast forward a couple of centuries and the same stones stand witness to an astonishing transformation. In 1562, a former nun in Bologna named Sister Clara publicly abandons her habit, declaring that her vocation lies not in vows but in hospitality and comfort. She proceeds to open a brothel within the very walls of her old convent, repurposing cells into private chambers and cloister gardens into courtyards for gentlemen callers. Her establishment, called the Cloister of Delight, caters primarily to wealthy merchants, minor nobility, and some clerics who believe they can indulge without consequence. Clara hires ex-nuns and local women adept in music, conversation, and art of the courtly dance. Within months, the Cloister of Delight earns a notorious reputation for its annual masquerade balls, where men pay premium fees to dance with women in former choir stalls, masked and in borrowed habits. Meanwhile, forged relics flood the market. In 1583, the prioress of a small Cistercian abbey in France boasts that her convent holds the genuine blood of Saint Genevieve. Pilgrims arrive daily to kneel before a small bone vial, but when a skeptical bishop inspects the relic, he finds it is merely a colored glass vial filled with red water. Yet he issues a gentle rebuke rather than an outright condemnation because removing the relic could deprive the convent of crucial pilgrimage income. A few miles away, another convent claims to possess the fingerbone of Saint Martha, prompting local merchants to build an entire row of stalls selling trifles, rosary beads, painted icons, and miniature banners. The boundary between devotion and commerce blurs as convents, pressured by declining incomes and political upheaval, turn to relic sales as a lifeline. Trial proceedings during this later era become spectacles. In 1602, Mother Superior Isabella faces charges for misusing funds to refurbish her personal quarters into a library of profane poetry, never mind that she was a celebrated poetess. Her trial, held in the bishop's courtyard, draws townsfolk with papal proclamations on the bench and a crowd murmuring about moral decay. She argues that art and literature uplift the spirit and that her library preserves threatened manuscripts. Ultimately, she receives a modest penance, 3 years of silent reading from approved texts, demonstrating the Vatican's ambivalence as it grapples with reform, profit, and public opinion. Between these lies a central question: is economic survival achieved through brothels or relic commerce compatible with spiritual integrity? In the earlier era, convents lived on alms, donations, and modest dowries. The idea of profiting off a relic seemed sacrilegious. Yet necessity sometimes dictated selling surplus produce or charging small pilgrim fees. In the later era, the stakes rose, convents facing dwindling incomes and political insecurity, particularly after the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, turned to more sensational revenue sources. Sister Clara's brothel and Mother Superior Isabella's literary collection represent two sides of the same coin. Both sought to adapt to economic pressures, yet their methods endangered the convent's reputation and strained the faithful's trust. The dilemma, then, pits pragmatic entrepreneurship against the ideals of piety, leaving each abbess, prioress, and sister to navigate a precarious balance between fiscal necessity and spiritual duty. Era of sealed doors and skeptical devotion, 14th to 15th centuries. Within the same Italian convent, records from 1425 describe a nun named Sister Rosalia who, upon hearing tales of her distant cousin's successful silk embroidery business, pondered how the convent might similarly thrive. Yet she dared not propose selling silken veils, fearing accusations of worldliness. Instead, Sister Rosalia cultivated a small flock of silkworms in the orchard, producing a few yards of silk each season. Only a fraction went to embellish altar cloths. The rest, she reasoned, could be bartered with local merchants for cheese, wine, or modest donations. Without publicly advertising her humble commerce, she calculated that even small gains might feed a few or fund repairs to leaky gutters. Her actions remained largely hidden from formal records. The prioress received a small wicker basket of fabric and issued a generic note of gratitude to local benefactor, preserving the semblance of mystique. In another far-flung corner of Europe, a Franciscan convent in Portugal faced chronic famine in 1438. Sister Teresa, the convent's infirmarian, began producing miracle ointments, small jars labeled St. Francis's balm, that smelt faintly of rosemary and citrus. Rumor spread that these balms cured headaches, sore throats, and even melancholy. Villagers arrived daily to purchase toffees in exchange for little more than a few coins. Though the prioress insisted on a strict ration schedule, she quietly allowed Sister Teresa to distribute extra jars to the needy. By year's end, the convent's communal granary had enough saved to endure another winter. In this era, then, convents found subtle ways to monetize skills, silk, herbs, honey, yet maintained enough discretion to avoid the official label of religious commerce. These early enterprises offered modest relief without public scandal. Era of flagship brothels and ecclesiastical compromises, 16th to 17th centuries. Now visualize that same convent, but in 1570, a time when papal decrees have grown more concerned with doctrinal purity than economic stability. The former abbey chapel, deconsecrated after a mysterious fire, becomes the grand salon of Sister Clara's new establishment. Thick velvet drapes decorate the walls, satin cushions line the pews. Beneath, painted frescoes of saints, dancers in corsets and silk skirts swirl to lute music. Although the official line calls it a house of hospitality for distressed ladies, everyone knows it as a brothel. Clara hires a small militia of former soldiers to guard the gates. Their presence, ironically, lends a veneer of legitimacy. Local magistrates, some secretly frequenting the establishment, turn a blind eye as long as taxes are paid and no clergy publicly protest. Concurrently, in northern France, a once-esteemed Benedictine convent, desperate after decades of poor harvests, brainstorms with a lay advisor, Monsieur Lefebvre, on how to draw pilgrims. The solution, a newly discovered relic. The convent proclaims that it has just received a drop of the holy blood of Christ, wrapped in a small vial. Fleur-de-lis banners hang outside, and Lefebvre hires artisans to craft ornate stands for the relic, inscribed with gilded letters, testimony of divine mercy. Pilgrims flock for miles around, paying tithes to gaze upon the relic. Yet when the local bishop finally investigates after hearing rumors, he discovers that the vial contains nothing but a pinch of saffron and red dye. Instead of ordering a purge, he quietly allows the relic's removal in exchange for a partial share of donations to rebuild local orphanages. The money helps fund a new wing for the convent's infirmary, yet at the cost of diluting the sanctity of relic veneration. At the same time, high church officials, consumed by the Counter-Reformation, sometimes prioritize outward unity over strict punishment. A 1605 papal edict outlines severe penalties for nuns engaged in improper enterprises, but enforcement proves sporadic. In a widely circulated pamphlet, Mother Superior Genevieve, accused of mismanaging convent funds for decadent feasts, defends her actions by arguing that joyful celebration fosters welfare and strengthens faith. Though she is forced to recant, the abbess remains in her position, testimony to the Church's pragmatic need to avoid public discord. These two contrasting eras bring us back to a familiar crossroads. How should convents balance economic survival with spiritual authenticity? In the first era, Sister Rosalia's modest silk production or Sister Teresa's healing balms offered discreet, life-sustaining solutions that upheld communal values. By contrast, Clarara's brothel and the Holy Blood relic represent a stark compromise, sensational ventures that risked scandal but injected much-needed funds. When convent leaders turn to brothels or forged relics, they gamble with their congregation's moral authority. On one hand, they stave off destitution, on the other, they sow seeds of distrust among the faithful. The dilemma forces each convent's leadership to decide how far to go in subordinating spiritual ideals to temporal needs. Is it acceptable to cloak commerce in holiness, or does that equate to spiritual hypocrisy? Diogenes the Cynic, A Life of Radical Simplicity and Social Critique. Era of comfortable conventions and emerging cynicism. Imagine Athens around 400 BCE, its marble temples bathed in golden sunlight, crowded agora stalls brimming with goods, and philosophers in flowing robes debating ethics under olive trees. In one such corner, a young man named Diogenes, born into a wealthy, well-connected family in the Greek city of Sinope, rises to prominence, but not in the way one might expect from a banker's son. When accusations surface that his father's mint has been shaving coins, literally reducing their silver content, Diogenes chooses exile over disgrace. He arrives in Athens with no wealth, no home, and a single cloak. In the era's context, personal honor, family reputation, and public appearance mattered enormously. Yet Diogenes embraces an iconoclastic path. He rejects possessions, sleeps in a large ceramic jar, often mistakenly called a barrel, and scorns polite conventions. In this era where social standing is measured by land ownership, elegant attire, and philosophical pedigree, Diogenes stands out as a radical anomaly. He carries a small lantern in broad daylight, proclaiming he is looking for an honest man, an act meant to embarrass fellow Athenians into questioning the integrity of society's elites. Athenians, accustomed to polite debate and rhetorical skill, find Diogenes' bluntness jarring, even offensive. They expect a philosopher to discuss virtue in sophisticated rhetorical flourishes, not to howl at the marketplace. Yet Diogenes' eccentric behavior, his disdain for social niceties, attracts attention and growing followers who become known as cynics. They adopt his philosophy of living in harmony with nature, shunning artificial comforts, and speaking truth to power. Era of enduring influence and modern relevance. Now fast forward to our own era where minimalism trends on social media and tiny houses garner lifestyle envy. In this context, Diogenes' radical simplicity looks a lot like the latest movement to declutter. Yet his critique cuts deeper. He attacks hypocrisy and the pretense of wealth, not just the clutter of possessions. We see his influence in contemporary voices who challenge consumer culture, from modern minimalists who live out of a single backpack to provocative street artists like Banksy, whose anonymity and irreverent critique of power echo Diogenes' defiance of polished institutions. Even Stoic philosophers, popular today in leadership seminars and self-help literature, trace their roots to Diogenes' emphasis on inner freedom and resilience. In our modern era, Diogenes also inspires activists who call out corporate greed, political hypocrisy, and social elitism. When a young protester today stands on a skyscraper plaza holding a sign that reads, "I want to hear the truth," she channels the spirit of Diogenes' daylight lantern. In corporate boardrooms, executives sometimes refer to channeling their inner Diogenes to remind themselves to cut through bureaucratic nonsense. Though centuries separate the pith-helmeted philosopher from today's world, his simple acts, a public, dog-like bark at convention, his refusal to own anything more than a cloak, resonate powerfully in a culture awash with material abundance yet starved for authentic values. That contrast between eras points us to a central question: how does one balance the comforts and structures of society with a commitment to radical authenticity? In Diogenes' world, the era of comfortable conventions championed wealth, status, and rhetorical skill as pathways to virtue. Diogenes rejects all of it, believing that society's trappings breed dishonesty. But in our era of consumer abundance, one could argue that Diogenes' extreme simplicity is impractical. After all, few of us can survive long without at least a roof over our heads or means to purchase food. Does that mean his philosophy is obsolete? Or does it simply mean we must adapt his principles, honesty, self-sufficiency, and skepticism toward pretense to contemporary challenges? Finding the balance between living comfortably and remaining true to one's deepest values becomes a dilemma both in ancient Athens and modern times. Era of public provocation and philosophical feats. 4th century BCE. Diogenes' life is filled with memorable episodes that underscore his uncompromising stance. One such occurrence involves Plato, the renowned philosopher. Plato once defined a human being as a featherless biped. Diogenes famously plucked a chicken and brought it into Plato's academy, exclaiming, "Here is Plato's human." Plato's response, to amend his definition by adding with broad, flat nails, illustrates the immediate impact of Diogenes' wit. No lecture hall or written discourse could deliver that lesson more powerfully than actual performance. Then there's the story of Alexander the Great. When the young conqueror, fresh from victories in Persia, visits Athens, he hears about Diogenes living in a jar at the gymnasium. Alexander finds Diogenes lounging in the sun and offers to grant him any wish. Diogenes, without even looking up, merely says, "Stand out of my light." Alexander, amused and impressed, reportedly remarks, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." In this interaction, we see Diogenes wielding immense moral authority despite his apparent destitution. The contrast is breathtaking. Alexander, master of half the known world, versus Diogenes, owner of nothing, yet possessing the power to dismiss a king's greatest offer with a single sentence. Another iconic anecdote has Diogenes publicly masturbating in the marketplace. When questioned, he explains that he is simply fulfilling a natural need, challenging the idea that natural, human actions must be shrouded in shame. His point is not to offend for the sake of it, but to demonstrate that societal taboos, those that deem natural acts unclean, are often arbitrary. Likewise, when he is once asked what wine he likes best, Diogenes retorts, "That which belongs to another," poking fun at conventions of ownership. Even his everyday habits become philosophical statements. He discards a cup once he sees a child drinking water from her hands, remarking, "It's clear that Diogenes has beaten us in plain living." In this era, Diogenes' teachings are transmitted orally or through anecdotes collected by biographers like Diogenes Laertius. He rarely writes, but his presence is felt wherever hypocrisy surfaces. He wanders through crowded streets shouting obscenities at people for acting as though virtue can be bought. For Diogenes, true freedom means having no master, because if you need nothing, you can't be enslaved. His life itself, living in a jar, begging for scraps, sleeping on hard ground, becomes a continuous critique of Athens' obsession with wealth, reputation, and power. Era of intellectual legacy and cultural reinterpretation, modern times to present. Move the clock ahead 2,000 years, and you find Diogenes reinterpreted in countless ways. A figure of comic relief in ancient pottery, a cautionary tale in philosophical treatises, and a mascot for various countercultural movements. In modern academic settings, professors compare Diogenes' cynicism to existentialist themes. His disregard for societal conventions resonates with Jean-Paul Sartre's emphasis on personal freedom. In corporate leadership seminars, Diogenes is held up as an archetype of bold truth-telling, someone who barks at pretense and asks uncomfortable questions of leaders. His legendary lantern, searching for an honest man, becomes a metaphor for due diligence and ethical leadership. In the 20th century, the Beat generation, writers like Kerouac and Ginsberg, embraced the spirit of Diogenes' wandering asceticism, celebrating vagrancy, spontaneity, and a refusal to settle into soul-numbing routines. Today, you can find Diogenes referenced in memes that mock consumer capitalism, illustrations of a bearded philosopher in a barrel juxtaposed with images of luxury brands. On social media, minimalist influencers echo Diogenes' call to live with less, documenting capsules wardrobes and one-bag travel, invoking a lineage that connects their capsule closets to Diogenes' single cloak. In academic journals, scholars revisit Diogenes' role in shaping the Cynic school, tracing how his ideas influenced Stoicism. They note that when Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius writes about living according to nature, his ideas trace back to Diogenes' simple acts, like discarding his cup. Yet modern interpretations also recognize the limitations of literal cynicism. Few seriously advocate public urination as a political statement today. Instead, Diogenes' true legacy lies in the radical idea that social conventions are not necessarily virtuous, that questioning appearances is itself a moral act, and that personal integrity can outweigh social gain. All these moments between ancient Athens and our own century converge on a single challenge. How do we honor the call for radical authenticity without sliding into mere spectacle. In Diogenes' time, his acts, whether plucking a chicken or living in a jar, served to puncture illusions and force Athenians to confront their cherished pretenses. But when interpreted too literally, say, if a modern skeptic attempts to mimic Diogenes by public indecency, such actions can become mere spectacle, losing their philosophical edge. Conversely, in our era of information overload, simply quoting Diogenes or wearing ragged clothing does not necessarily lead to the integrity he championed. His fundamental ask, live honestly, shun hypocrisy, and question authority, can be overshadowed by people seeking shock value rather than genuine inquiry. The dilemma of translating radical simplicity and critique across centuries challenges each generation to find meaningful ways to question their own assumptions without resorting to empty stunts or superficial mimicking. Provocations and paradoxes. Diogenes' legacy in modern America. Era of mid-20th century counterculture, 1950s, 1970s. Imagine an American college campus in the late 1950s. The post-war boom brings economic prosperity, but beneath that prosperity, a restless generation begins to chafe at conformity. In lecture halls across the country, professors introduce students to classical philosophy, including the life of Diogenes the Cynic. Young intellectuals, influenced by World War II's horrors and the rise of consumer culture, respond to Diogenes' legend, his barrel dwelling, his disdain for material wealth, his public acts of unfiltered truth-telling with excitement. The beat poets like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg adopt a Diogenes-inspired disdain for social norms. Ginsberg's poem, Howl, echoes Diogenes' bluntness. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, a line that resonates with Diogenes' view of an Athens drunk on its own pretenses. On the West Coast, Bay Area coffee houses host gatherings where students and local artists recite lines from Lives of Eminent Philosophers by Diogenes Laertius. In one memorable reading, a voice reads Diogenes plucking a chicken in Plato's Academy, followed by laughter and a spontaneous discussion about how, if Plato's definition of a human can be lampooned so simply, what else in our society is built on shaky definitions? That moment sparks student protests, challenging campus dress codes and demanding more egalitarian dining halls. Meanwhile, beatniks living in single-room apartments decorate their sparse rooms with battered jars and lanterns. No cards pinned above their desks referencing Diogenes' dictum, cultivate your garden, while literally living on ramen noodles and thrift store clothing. As the 1960s consciousness movement blossoms, Diogenes' story fuels the slogan Live Simply, so that others may simply live. Hippies trading their school textbooks for road trips view his barrel not as degradation, but as freedom from social expectations. In San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district, someone erects a cardboard sign reading, Diogenes would be proud, next to a tent camped with on-the-move idealists. But even as Diogenes' radical simplicity inspires them, tensions arise. Some adopt simplicity as mere aesthetic, long hair, tie-dyed shirts, while wealthier followers still jet off to India on financed, spiritual journeys. This creates friction between those who genuinely renounce wealth and those for whom minimalism remains a fashion. Era of 21st century digital minimalism and street art provocations. 2000s, present. Flip the calendar to 2021, and the landscape has shifted. Instead of coffee houses, Diogenes' legacy propagates on social media. Minimalism influencers, Mary's Kondo if you will, post videos of emptying closets, emphasizing reveal the essential. They quote Diogenes. He has the most who is most content with the least. Readers in small urban apartments pare down to capsule wardrobes, posting the hashtag Diogenes challenge to show how few possessions they need. Meanwhile, at tech conferences, keynote speakers reference Diogenes not as a historical footnote, but as a touchstone for ethical leadership, urging executives to carry your own lantern in a world of artificial intelligence, to question whether innovation really serves human flourishing. On the streets of New York and Los Angeles, anonymous street artists inspired by Diogenes' provocations stencil silhouettes of him holding a lantern next to corporate headquarters. A striking mural appears in Bushwick. Diogenes, standing atop a Cadillac, lantern raised, with the caption, Seeking Truth in a World of Likes. Passers-by pause to snap pictures, share them on Instagram, and debate whether the message critiques big tech or the vacuity of social media validation. Other guerrilla performance artists, dressed in tattered coats, carrying jars, stage search for the honest man, routines in Wall Street's financial district, shouting questions about corporate accountability. Videos of these acts go viral, generating discussion threads about the authenticity of viral protest versus Diogenes' face-to-face confrontations. Meanwhile, in Silicon Valley, a handful of tech companies pilot cynic residences, in which employees must spend 1 week living with only one backpack of essentials. No Wi-Fi, no digital devices. Mirroring Diogenes' call to live in accordance with nature, some participants emerge inspired, others complain of withdrawal. The term Diogenes effect begins circulating in venture capital circles as shorthand for the tendency to discard unproductive ideas. If it doesn't spark joy or ROI, toss it out. A nod to Diogenes' ruthless shaving of unnecessary philosophical fluff. Yet for all this enthusiasm, critics argue that 21st century Diogenes cosplay often remains superficial. It's easier to star in a viral video wearing a barrel costume than to genuinely renounce a multimillion-dollar startup paycheck. At the heart of these emerges the question: how can Diogenes' radical authenticity inspire real change rather than fleeting spectacle? In the mid-20th century counterculture, Diogenes fueled genuine social critique, questioning militarism, consumerism, and academic elitism. But as hippies adopted certain aesthetic markers without fully embracing his ethos, Diogenes' message risked dilution. In our digital age, minimalism influencers can carry lanterns in their Instagram stories, but if they immediately refill those empty closets after the camera turns off, does that echo true cynic philosophy? Or is it merely fodder for likes? The dilemma challenges each generation. Is it enough to borrow Diogenes' brand for a social media moment? Or must one weave his uncompromising critique into their everyday ethics? At stake is authentic engagement versus hollow mimicry. Era of academic reception and pop philosophical inquiry, late 20th century. In the 1970s and 1980s, American universities incorporate Diogenes' cynicism into broader philosophical curricula. Lecturers ask, why did Diogenes reject Plato's forms? Even when Plato stood at the pinnacle of Athenian intellectual life, they assigned students to live 1 week on campus with no money beyond a few drachmae equivalent. The assignment, called Cynic in the Quad, attempts to replicate Diogenes' detachment from material comforts. Some students report feeling liberated, discovering they don't need a brand-name wardrobe to be accepted. Others, however, confess frustration with the assignment's superficial demands, e.g., sleeping in campus corridors, and leave after a day. Educational conferences host panels titled Diogenes and Environmental Ethics, exploring how his respect for nature and disdain for excess resonates with the emerging ecology movement. Journal articles, often peppered with Diogenes' quips, argue that if Diogenes could mock institutional corruption by plucking a chicken, today's activists can expose corporate malfeasance through culture jamming. One memorable college debate features a student presenting a video mashup, clips of Diogenes' antics interwoven with footage of modern CEOs touting superfluous gadgets. The student concludes, if Diogenes lived among us, his lantern would be wired to a solar panel, and he'd upload his dissents on YouTube. Within these academic spaces, however, a paradox emerges. Instructors caution students that simply performing Diogenes-style stunts, like publicly bathing in a fountain, does not capture his philosophical core. They stress that the cynic emphasis on virtue, self-sufficiency, and sincerity must precede any provocative act. Thus, while Diogenes' life becomes fodder for creative assignments and pop culture references, deeper engagement remains uneven. Some students wholeheartedly embrace the challenge of radical self-examination. Others dismiss it as an eccentric relic of a bygone era, quirky, but not applicable to modern life. Era of viral memes and decentralized movements, 21st century. Fast forward to the 2010s and beyond. With smartphones ubiquitous, Diogenes' image is distilled into emojis and meme templates. A bearded figure standing in a barrel, lantern aloft, captioned, when your Wi-Fi drops, Looking for a more honest connection. TikTok influencers upload 15-second skits. One cosplayer, lantern in hand, asks magical realism questions like, "Is this the line for Starbucks? I'm looking for an honest line." These skits generate thousands of likes, but few viewers pause to reflect on Diogenes' broader critique of societal pretense. At the same time, street art collectives leverage Diogenes' iconography. A collaborative mural in Philadelphia depicts him tearing down a billboard advertising fast fashion. A nearby QR code links to a nonprofit website advocating sustainable clothing. Protesters at Occupy Wall Street in 2011 held placards reading, "Diogenes in my jar, corporate greed on fire," merging ancient critique with contemporary economic demands. Similarly, environmental activists in Portland organize Cynic Clean UPS, where participants pick trash from public parks wearing simple gray tunics, reclaiming public space as Diogenes once reclaimed the marketplace from hypocrisy. Yet as decentralized as these movements are, they wrestle with consistency. Some cynic cleanup participants wear the tunics for selfies and then head to a craft brewery. An uneasy mix of activist posturing and comfort seeking. Meanwhile, memes circulate so quickly that Diogenes emerges as a punchline rather than a profound challenge. Sell all your stuff and move into a barrel? Nah, too cold. Maybe I'll just delete Instagram for the weekend. The speed of digital culture means that Diogenes' radical call to question values can be reduced to a one-off gesture, dissolved in an endless scroll. Between these two modern eras surfaces the familiar tension. How can Diogenes' call to radical honesty maintain depth amid rapid, superficial appropriation? In academic contexts, instructors may require students to achieve genuine self-sufficiency, spending a week burning their credit cards in order to internalize Diogenes' critique. Yet in practice, many students retreat to familiar comforts once the assignment ends, undermining its intended impact. In social media and protest settings, Diogenes' lantern becomes a prop for catchy visuals, but the underlying philosophical challenge, questioning deeply held assumptions, often goes unexamined. Activists don't always connect their cynic cleanup selfies with calls to overhaul systems of production and consumption. The dilemma forces us to ask, is it enough to borrow Diogenes' style, or must we also wrestle with his substance? The risk is that, without ongoing reflection, the bright spark of Diogenes' truth-telling fades into mere spectacle. Prelude to Little Big Horn, Treaties, Tensions, and Tribal Unity. Era of Treaty Promises and Relative Equilibrium, 1868 to 1874. Picture the rolling plains of the northern Great Plains in the autumn of 1868. A vast council gathers along the banks of the Yellowstone River. On one side stand Lakota Sioux leaders, spiritual figures like Red Cloud and military stalwarts like Spotted Tail, wrapped in buffalo robes and crowned with eagle feathers. On the other, representatives of the United States government, draped in blue uniforms and carrying parchment scrolls. The resulting agreement, known as the Treaty of Fort Laramie, declares that the Black Hills and a vast swath of territory in what would become South Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana belong to the Lakota in perpetuity. In this era, for a brief moment, there is relative calm and cooperation. The Lakota maintain freedom to hunt buffalo across their winter grounds, while the United States commits to providing provisions, rations of flour, sugar, coffee, when food is scarce. American traders venture into reservation borders to exchange goods. Beaded moccasins for metal kettles, painted blankets for whiskey. A small Lakota child, perhaps 10 Bears' grandson, runs along the riverbanks, chasing prairie dogs while Cheyenne children watch from teepees clustered a mile away. On the plains, unity prevails. In summer, families gather for celebrations, and elders tell stories of Wakan Tonka's creation of the world. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army establishes a modest outpost, Fort Laramie no longer, but scouting detachments moving quietly to respect treaty lines. Surveyors sometimes politely request permission to lay lines for future telegraph poles. Tribal leaders generally consent, trusting promises etched into treaty documents. For 6 years, from 1868 through 1874, this uneasy balance holds. True, there are occasional disputes over horse thefts or encroaching ranchers, but on the whole, the land remains under Lakota stewardship. Visitors to Standing Rock report seeing Buffalo Hills alive with herds, and for a generation, the buffalo roam undisturbed. But even as treaty delegates shake hands and share communal meals of fried buffalo and dried corn, shadowy forces gather. Word of gold in the distant Black Hills. Rumors relayed by trappers who stumbled upon sparkling flakes. Circulates in barrooms from St. Louis to San Francisco. Yet at this point, the gold fever remains remote. A faint rumor half believed, half dismissed. Both nations, Lakota and United States, navigate a tentative peace, leaning on the belief that treaties, once inked, will be honored. Families on the reservations teach children to follow the buffalo migration. U.S. officials focus on rebuilding after the Civil War rather than aggressively expanding west. It is an era marked by cautious optimism, despite undercurrents of uncertainty. Era of gold fever and broken promises. 1874. June 1876. Fast forward to the summer of 1874. An expedition led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer pushes into the Black Hills, ostensibly to scout routes for railroads. Custer's horse-mounted scouts, including Crow and Iroquois allies, stumble upon glittering veins of gold near present-day Deadwood. News spreads like wildfire. Newspapers in Chicago and New York publish headlines screaming, "Gold in the hills." Within weeks, tens of thousands of prospectors, some drawn by genuine hope, others by wild dreams, descend on sacred Lakota territory, trampling fragile prairie and trespassing reservation boundaries. What had seemed a faraway rumor now becomes an unstoppable tide. Ranchers tip their hats, then quietly acquire Army surplus rifles to protect their new homesteads. Towns balloon overnight. Deadwood springs up around makeshift saloons where whiskey flows freely, gamblers shout numbers, and young women from the east strike gold at panning stations. By winter 1875, Lakota leaders report that barricades of men clog what had been buffalo trails. Elderly Sioux warriors shake their heads, recalling the promise that the Black Hills would remain forever their home, now in danger of being measured by pickaxes and covered by tents. Despite pleas from Sitting Bull, who declares that the hills are the heart of our creation story, and from Crazy Horse, who warns that no amount of paper promises can stand against the greed for gold, the U.S. government sends a mixed response. Officially, they reaffirm treaty guarantees, but in practice, Army commanders and political appointees suggest buying the land peacefully at unfair prices. Lakota negotiators refuse. How can one place a monetary value on sacred hills where their ancestors lie? By early 1876, U.S. General Philip Sheridan issues orders that any Lakota or Cheyenne not on the reservation by January 31, 1876, shall be considered hostile. Rebel groups form, but messages get lost across vast winter hunting grounds. Some villages never receive the ultimatum. By June 1876, the once calm plains pulse with tension. Tribes gather in large encampments near the Little Bighorn River, uniting as they have never done before, as if to stand guard over lands their ancestors vowed to protect. A single question ripples through these. Can treaty promises hold firm when the lure of wealth and expansionist pressures collide with sacred commitments? In the first era, both sides, Lakota and U.S. officials, shared a fragile faith that written words could bind actions. That faith depended on the idea that once ink dried on parchment, mutual respect would prevail. But in the second era, as gold fever ignites, the value of treaty paper falls short against the shining metal prospectors seek. When Lakota children watch their elders deny the gold's glitter and confirm that the hills belong to us, they understand that the world is shifting beneath their moccasins. Meanwhile, ranchers and prospectors, seeing only the shimmering promise of instant wealth, believe their fate justified the trespass. The dilemma between honoring solemn oaths and pursuing perceived economic destiny foreshadows a larger, tragic conflict where neither side can reconcile its promises with its ambitions. Era of spiritual leadership and grassroots unity, 1875, early 1876. In the winter of 1875, as the buffalo herds dwindle under relentless hunting, Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho leaders convene a series of winter councils. Imagine Sitting Bull, Hunk Papa Lakota Holy Man, standing before a circle of bone-perfumed teepees at Fort Yates. He speaks of a leopard skin cloak he wore during a recent sun dance, where he received a vision of soldiers falling into our camp like grasshoppers. That prophecy electrifies his followers. At the same time, Crazy Horse, a quiet but fiercely determined Oglala chieftain, conducts winter drills near central Montana, training small war parties on the virtues of surprise and mobility. Unbeknownst to many U.S. commanders, a loose coalition forms. This alliance is not a traditional army. There is no unified chain of command, no singular war plan, but it is bound by a shared conviction. Protect the land, honor the buffalo, and resist forced removal. In early March 1876, a meeting at Fort Laramie convenes various tribal spokesmen. Chief Two Bears of the Cheyenne, Rain in the Face of the Minneconjou Lakota, and Little Wolf of the Northern Cheyenne. They share news from scouts. The army intends to encircle their camps, predictably by late June, to force them onto reservations. In response, they decide to delay any retreat or negotiations until after the summer hunt, confident that they can thrive if they remain united. By April, some Lakota send only partial delegations to the reservation. Instead of entire family bands signing the document, small groups trickle in to accept meager annuities, sometimes only flour, dried beans, and coffee, for staying on the reservation during the harsh winter. Their choice is strategic. Avoid being labeled hostile, while preserving the right to hunt until the buffalo return. Meanwhile, tribal elders circulate oral instructions. Never surrender the Black Hills. Never abandon the Sun Dance grounds, and never bow to treaties that others violate. It is an era in which spiritual conviction fuels political unity. The buffalo may have thinned, but hearts remain brimming with determination. Era of U.S. military initiative and strategic missteps. April-June 1876. Contrast that with the Army's perspective in the spring of 1876. General Alfred Terry, headquartered at Fort Abraham Lincoln near Bismarck, North Dakota, coordinates a three-pronged campaign. General George Crook in the south, General Alfred Terry in the center with the newly formed Dakota Column, and Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer leading the 7th Cavalry in the east. The grand strategy: trap the tribal encampments between converging forces and force them onto reservations. According to the War Department's pigeonhole planners, this should be a swift operation. The Army's horses outmatch buffalo, repeating rifles outgun bows, and discipline outclasses guerrilla skirmishes. Yet from the very beginning, miscalculations abound. Crook, delayed by lost wagons and Cheyenne scouts misleading his columns, fails to coordinate his southward approach. Meanwhile, Custer, hungering for glory after a brush with scandal in 1874, chooses speed over prudence. He leaves his Gatling guns, heavy but stabilizing, behind, convinced that his smaller, faster force can surprise an Indian village before it disperses. The plain degradation of maps further compounds issues. What Custer believes to be a small encampment a few miles north turns out to be part of a much larger gathering. Meanwhile, Terry's column, moving from the Missouri River, encounters supply shortages and poor communication, inadvertently giving tribal warriors crucial days to prepare. The Army's confidence, undergirded by sophisticated weaponry, masks flawed intelligence and underestimation of native resolve. By early June 1876, Army reconnaissance begins filtering through rumors of a massive encampment along the Little Bighorn River. Custer dismisses these reports, partially influenced by a common attitude. Native warriors are fragmented, unlikely to hold large gatherings, and prone to scatter. This misreading marks a turning point. As Army columns fan out across the frontier, the Lakota-Cheyenne alliance moves with discipline, congregating not out of naivete but to assert strength. When Custer's scouts report too many to count, he remains blinded by hubris, certain that, if these Indians must be punished, let it be today. In these weeks, tribal unity, rooted in spiritual conviction and strategic alliances, confronts a U.S. military decisiveness that, though formidable on paper, carries critical gaps in local knowledge and respect for cultural cohesion. A single question emerges between these: how do cultural understanding and respect shape or shatter the fates of two vastly different societies? In the first era, Lakota and Cheyenne leaders draw on centuries of shared spiritual practice, tying their identity to the land and buffalo migrations. Their unity arises organically from belief systems that place. Custer's men attempted to form a defensive perimeter on a knoll that would later be called Last Stand Hill. Early accounts described soldiers with leveled carbines firing rapidly as native riders Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho alike drove straight into their line. Surrounded on three sides, the cavalrymen dug in with what little cover they could muster: fallen horses, patches of brush, and the rugged ground itself. Historians differ on the precise sequence, but most agree that Custer and his officers, Tom Custer, Boston Custer, Captain Keogh, and others, fell quickly under enfilading fire. Native accounts speak of a fierce, personal combat, riders leaping from horses to wrestle rifles from wounded troopers, hand-to-hand engagements that underscored both warriors' determination and the cavalry's desperation. When survivors from Reno Hill reached Last Stand Hill the next morning, they found a horrifying scene. 210 men dead, their bodies stripped of clothing and weapons, a traditional practice meant to deny the enemy spoils. Evidence suggested that many soldiers fell near their mounts, shot in place, while a few sought cover in shallow greasewood thickets. Scouts recorded countless spent cartridges, so many spent that it confirmed Custer's men had fought to the very last bullet. The horse patrols of Keogh still guarded the perimeter to the end, and Custer's body was reportedly found kneeling or falling against the stump of a fallen pine tree. The scale of the defeat was staggering: over 200 soldiers killed within 2 hours. Custer's strategic gamble, splitting his regiment into multiple battalions, pursuing a flanking maneuver without full knowledge of enemy strength, had ended catastrophically. On Last Stand Hill, the cavalry's renowned discipline gave way to overwhelming force and superior tactics from native horsemen. The terrain, open ground surrounded by higher ridges, left Custer's men exposed, while warriors used speed, stealth, and intimate terrain knowledge to encircle and overwhelm them. That stark afternoon marks the second key moment in this era. Even a celebrated commander with elite troops can find himself outflanked and historically undone when underestimating an opponent's unity and resolve. Between those two moments, Reno's precarious stand and Custer's final stand, emerges a critical question: was Custer's last stand an act of reckless hubris or a tragic inevitability once initial plans faltered? On one side, critics point to Custer's decision to press on despite warnings from scouts, his refusal to wait for reinforcements or Gatling guns, and his underestimation of native numbers. They see a commander driven more by a desire for personal glory than careful strategy. His choice to divide a 600-man regiment into smaller detachments against a massive, unified encampment suggests boldness bordering on foolhardiness. Conversely, supporters argue that once Reno's assault faltered, forcing the tribal alliance to shift resources to that flank, Custer's options narrowed. The collapse of one prong of the pincer thrust might have made Custer's final maneuver a desperate necessity rather than an optional gamble. In the fog of war, with limited intelligence and fractured communications, some defenders argue he seized what he believed was a fleeting chance to strike decisively. This dilemma of recklessness versus necessity pervades discussions of Custer's last stand. Was he a tragic hero, cut down in a valiant effort to save his men and enforce U.S. orders? Or was he a cautionary example of how ambition and arrogance can lead to catastrophe? Depending on one's perspective on military decision-making and cultural context, Custer's final march can be seen as both a fateful error and an unavoidable crossroads of war. Era of immediate aftermath and national mourning, late 1876. In the months following the battle, news of Custer's defeat reverberated across the United States. Newspapers, many still owned by Civil War veterans or Southern partisans, labeled the battle a massacre. Graphic descriptions, often sensationalized, filled the front pages: 17 officers and 210 enlisted men wiped from the face of the earth, one headline proclaimed. Coffeehouse patrons in New York City and saloon-goers in St. Louis trembled at the thought of native warriors defeating a U.S. Army column. Politicians in Washington, D.C. seized the moment to galvanize public support for accelerated funding of the Indian Wars. Congress approved a swift increase in military appropriations. More troops and supplies were poured into the plains. Meanwhile, in Dakota Territory, survivors of Reno Hill trekked to Fort Abraham Lincoln to file first-hand reports. They described Custer's last stand hill as littered with U.S. uniforms, shattered Winchester rifles, and personal effects: gold rings, letters, and even a few religious medals. The army dispatched relief columns commanded by General Terry in July, finding the bones of fallen soldiers already bleached by summer sun. Skeletal remains, some intact with tattered uniforms, were collected and given quick burials, though no formal honors could match the tragedy of the fight. Mourners in the East held candlelit vigils. In Cincinnati, a bishop led a prayer service for the fallen American heroes, urging unity against a savage threat, language typical of the era's prevailing attitudes. Public sentiment hardened, pushing U.S. policy firmly toward total subjugation of Plains tribes. Within months, federal forces led by Generals Alfred Terry and Phil Sheridan scoured areas surrounding the Little Bighorn River, seeking to suppress any lingering pockets of resistance. Some bands, anticipating the retribution, fled toward Canada, others surrendered reluctantly to reservation life, starving and demoralized. By the winter of 1876–77, the Lakota-Cheyenne alliance had frayed under relentless military pressure. Though they had achieved a stunning victory, their options narrowed to survival on reservations under government watch. This era, marked by national mourning, rapid military buildup, and punitive expeditions, underscores how one battlefield loss became a rallying point for intensified campaigns against indigenous sovereignty. Era of memory, myth, and evolving perspectives, late 19th century, present. Contrast that with how the Battle of Little Bighorn has been remembered and reinterpreted over subsequent generations. In the late 1800s, pamphlets and dime novels painted Custer as a gallant martyr, a boy general cut down by bloodthirsty savages. Statues rose in his honor. In Helena, Montana, and in Monroe, Michigan, communities celebrated Custer Days with parades, reenactments, and patriotic speeches. Meanwhile, Sioux elders and Cheyenne survivors told their own stories, emphasizing the unity and bravery that saved their families. But those perspectives were often marginalized in mainstream accounts, overshadowed by the Custer myth. In the early 20th century, historian Frederick Whitaker reevaluated the battle, questioning whether Custer's detachment truly stood a chance. His work, though controversial, opened doors for more nuanced studies. By mid-century, Native American scholars like Vine Deloria Jr. and historians such as D. Brown, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, 1970, shifted attention toward indigenous experiences, casting the battle as one moment in a broader context of broken treaties and colonial expansion. Reenactment groups and museums like the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument, established in 1946, began including markers and interpretive plaques that acknowledged Native perspectives. In modern academia, the battle is studied as a complex intersection of military tactics, cultural conflict, and memory politics. Courses examine not only Custer's strategic errors but also the negotiations that led tribes to assemble there in the first place. Recently, documentary filmmakers have interviewed descendants of Native warriors, sharing oral histories previously neglected. Contemporary tribal members hold annual memorial ceremonies on Last Stand Hill, rituals that blend Lakota cultural protocols with modern calls for justice and treaty recognition. Yet popular culture remains fascinated by Custer's last stand. Hollywood films, from the epic 1941 They Died with Their Boots On to more critical treatments like the 1991 Son of the Morning Star, reflect evolving attitudes. In classrooms, students debate whether Custer deserves commemoration or condemnation. The battle's enduring legacy finds expression in art, literature, and public discourse, illustrating how historical memory is never static but continually reshaped by present concerns. From indigenous rights movements to reflections on American imperialism. As that long arc of interpretation shows, we face a persistent dilemma. How do we honor the complexity of this pivotal moment without succumbing to simplistic heroes or villains? In the immediate aftermath, Custer was lionized as a heroic martyr, his Native opponents cast as merciless aggressors. Yet as decades passed, voices from both sides urged a more balanced view. Custer's ambition and flawed judgment led to tragedy, but Native unity and determination protected families and lands. Today's question becomes, should we erect statues to Custer to celebrate military valor, or honor the resilience and sovereignty of the Lakota and Cheyenne? The dilemma challenges us to decide whether to maintain traditional narratives that celebrate conquest or to embrace a nuanced understanding that recognizes treaty violations, cultural survival, and shifting power dynamics. Imperial ambitions realized, conception and construction of the Forbidden City. Era of visionary ambition and monumental construction, 1406 to 1420. Picture northern China in 1406, under the rule of the Yongle Emperor of the Ming Dynasty. He has already launched a grand naval expedition under Admiral Zheng He sought to move the capital from Nanjing to Beijing and desires a palace that will reflect his authority as son of heaven. His vision goes beyond a mere residence. He imagines a sprawling palace complex, a city of magnificence that will insulate him from political chaos and glitter with cosmic symbolism. The Yongle Emperor orders the construction of what we now call the Forbidden City. Over the next 14 years, more than 1 million laborers, craftsmen, and artisans are mobilized from across China. Logs of precious nanmo wood come from Sichuan, hauled by teams of oxen over treacherous mountain paths. Enormous white marble blocks, each weighing many tons, are carved from quarries near Beijing and transported in autumn when rivers freeze, using sleds across the ice. Kills fire millions of glazed roof tiles in the Jindajan style. Their vibrant yellows and greens symbolize imperial authority and longevity. As the foundation is laid, workers follow strict geomantic rules. Feng Shui principles dictate orientation and layout. The palace is aligned precisely on a north-south axis, mirroring the cosmic axis mundi. At its heart, the three main halls, Hall of Supreme Harmony, Hall of Central Harmony, and Hall of Preserving Harmony, rise in ascending terraces of marble, their grand staircases guarded by stone dragons. The glazed eaves, adorned with 9 sons of the dragon figurines, protect sacred rooftops from evil. Brick by brick, tile by tile, pavilions and courtyards expand outward, ultimately covering some 180 acres and comprising more than 900 buildings. In this era, the sheer scale is staggering. Estimates of the workforce range from 700,000 to over 1 million, drawn from peasants conscripted for months at a time, supplemented by specialized artisans, carpenters, architects, sculptors. From across the empire. When the main halls are completed in 1420, the Yongle Emperor ascends the dragon throne in the Hall of Supreme Harmony. Musicians play court music, banners flutter, and the courtiers bow in thrall beneath glittering golden roofs. The emperor's dream has come true, a palace city so vast that ordinary citizens may never set foot inside. To be close to the emperor is to be on sacred ground. Each gate crossing, each bowing gesture reaffirms hierarchical cosmic order. Era of dynastic continuity and Qin transformation, 1644 to 1912. Fast forward to 1644, the Ming dynasty, beset by famine, corruption, and peasant uprisings, falls to the Manchu rebels who established the Qin dynasty. Instead of raising the Forbidden City, the new rulers decide to adopt it as their own imperial seat, an acknowledgement of Beijing's cosmic status and a savvy move to legitimize Manchu rule. They rename it Zhijianchun, the Purple Forbidden City, retaining much of the original architecture but gradually adding Manchu rituals and inscriptions in Manchu script. Under the Qing's Kangxi Emperor R. 1661 to 1722, the palace complex sees expansions, new pavilions for study, gardens featuring Manchu-style rockeries, and special halls for ancestral worship. Kangxi builds the Hall of Mental Cultivation, Yanxinggan, behind the main halls, where he and successive emperors would sleep, study, and receive close advisors in relative seclusion. His grandson, the Qianlong Emperor R. 1735 to 1796, commissions artistic enhancements, detailed murals in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, refined stone balustrades, and an elaborate 9-dragon screen outside the Palace of Tranquil Longevity. Qianlong also repurposes an old Ming theater as his own palace opera stage, inviting Manchu and Han performers to present court dramas. During the late Qing era, especially under the Empress Dowager Cixi R. 1861 to 1908, the Forbidden City becomes a place of paradox. She rules from behind a screen, pulling strings on state affairs without ever formally ascending the throne. For purchases and renovations such as the Shiyuan Garden and a towering Western-style clock tower blend traditional Chinese architecture with European elements smuggled in by foreign envoys. Yet, as China faces foreign invasions and internal rebellions, parts of the palace fall into disrepair. The Boxer Rebellion, 1900, brings looting by European and American troops. Precious artifacts vanish, timber structures burn. When the young Emperor Puyi officially abdicates in 1912, the Forbidden City transitions from dynastic residence to symbolic relic of an imperial world. In this era, the palace functions as both a seat of unchallenged authority and, ironically, a gilded cage. Emperors and court officials move through daily rituals, morning audiences, sacrificial rites at the Hall of Supreme Harmony, yet the outside world surges with revolutionary fervor, industrialization, and foreign encroachments. For Cixi, seclusion behind the palace's high red walls serves as protection but also underscores her isolation from a rapidly changing nation. The evolution from Ming grandeur to Qing adaptation reveals how one physical space can embody continuity and transformation, reflecting shifting visions of power, culture, and legitimacy across centuries. Through those, a vital question emerges: how does a palace that symbolizes supreme authority balance the need for seclusion with the demands of effective governance? In the First Era, the Forbidden City's very purpose is to separate the emperor from common influence, projecting divine sovereignty. Yet Yanla and his successors quickly realized that isolation can breed detachment. Messengers must pass through multiple layers of eunuchs, ministers, and gatekeepers, slowing decisions and creating opportunities for intrigue. In the Second Era, Cixi's seclusion behind the Hall of Mental Cultivation fosters efficient control over ministries. She can command grand projects from her silk-lined chambers, but also blinds her to brewing rebellions like the 1911 Xinhai Uprising. In both ages, the dilemma persists: should the emperor retreat further into ceremonial chambers to preserve divine mystique, or occasionally step beyond gilded gates to engage directly with ministers and people? The answer shapes not just palace politics, but the fate of the empire itself. Era of ritual perfection and imperial authority, 1420 to 1600. Throughout the Ming dynasty, after the initial construction, emperors and court officials adhere to a rigorous routine guided by Confucian principles and cosmic symbolism. The Hall of Supreme Harmony hosts three major annual ceremonies: the enthronement, the emperor's birthday audience, and Lunar New Year greetings. Diagrams show exactly where each minister kneels, how many steps one must take before making a bow, and the precise number of tassels on banners. Even moving a single drum during ceremonies requires a red ink seal from the Grand Secretariat. Within the palace's rear, the inner court supports the emperor's private life. 6 palaces north of the main hall serve as residences for the empress, concubines, and imperial consorts. Each woman's status is defined by the number of golden lotus bloom brims on her porcelain dining bowls. Eunuchs, often castrated as youths and recruited from distant provinces, become indispensable as gatekeepers, messengers, and administrators. One eunuch, Wei Liang, rises through the ranks to become head of the Eastern Depot, an intelligence agency so powerful that ministers fear his influence. His discreet commentaries, delivered through sealed scrolls, rapidly shape imperial decrees on land management and tax reform. This era emphasizes ritual perfection as a form of political control. Ministers may spend weeks drafting a policy, yet the emperor's response, written in a single, bold phrase atop the document, can alter the course of provinces. The court's carefully choreographed dances at the imperial ancestral temple echo the emperor's role as intermediary between humans and gods. But this meticulous structure comes at a cost. While ceremonies captivate onlookers and secure a sense of cosmic legitimacy, they consume vast resources, ironically straining the very state coffers meant to fund governance. Officials report in private diaries that while we honor our ancestors, we starve our fields. Era of crisis and preservation, 1900-present. With the Qing dynasty's fall in 1912, the Forbidden City enters an era of dramatic reinvention. In 1924, warlord Feng Yuxiang forces the child Emperor Puyi to leave, though he remains allowed to inhabit the inner court until 1925. The palace's purpose shifts from residence to museum, an initial experiment aimed at preserving China's imperial heritage. In 1925, curator Zhang Jifu oversees the cataloging of over 600,000 artifacts, scrolls, porcelain vases, jade carvings scattered across dusty chambers and sealed rooms. During World War II, the Japanese occupation of Beijing threatens the Forbidden City's treasures. To protect the artifacts, Republican government officials pack historic scrolls and rare textiles onto trucks bound for the National Library in Nanjing. Other precious objects make their way to Taiwan as the Chinese Civil War intensifies. In these years, the palace's walls witness frantic cataloging and transport as curators risk life and limb to safeguard centuries of cultural patrimony. After 1949, the People's Republic of China reopens the palace as the Palace Museum. Restoration efforts, painstakingly overseen by art historians and architects, uncover original Ming-era colors beneath layers of Qing-era paint. Slowly, courtyards are rebuilt to match 15th-century designs, and ancient murals are stabilized with modern conservation techniques. The Hall of Supreme Harmony reclaims its golden rooftops while the narrow Wenchine study is restored to its former quiet. By the 1980s, major exhibitions draw record crowds, making the Palace Museum a focal point of national pride. Yet preservation brings its own dilemmas. Should restorers replace every decayed beam with new wood, or preserve the original timber even if it is brittle? Debates rage over whether a Qing-era clock tower should remain, an anachronism to some, a symbol of their grandmother's generation to others. Meanwhile, Beijing's skylines rise around the palace as modern skyscrapers peak above red walls. The contrast between the ancient complex and the city's burgeoning high-rises underscores the palace's precarious balance between historical authenticity and contemporary urban pressures. Across these stands a persistent question: how can the Forbidden City serve as both a living symbol of imperial authority and a dynamic, relevant cultural institution? In the Ming era, it serves as a stage for ritual and symbol, an expression of cosmic harmony that reassures subjects of the emperor's divine mandate but at times distracts rulers from pressing administrative disasters. In the modern era, it functions as a museum bolstering national identity and preserving priceless art, yet faces tensions between restoring original structures and accommodating millions of annual visitors. The dilemma between using the palace as a tool of power versus a resource of collective memory has shaped how architects, scholars, and policymakers engage with this icon of Chinese civilization. Thrones and thrall, intrigue, ritual, and power in the Forbidden City's inner court. Era 1: Consolidation and Early Ming Court Life, 1420 to 1500. Step through the Meridian Gate and imagine the bustle just beyond the main halls. The inner court lies further north, a secretive world reserved for the emperor, the empress, concubines, and a retinue of eunuchs. In the early Ming dynasty, after the Forbidden City's completion in 1420, the inner court's purpose was twofold: preserve the emperor's privacy and reinforce his divine status. The emperor lived behind high red walls, surrounded by ceremonial regalia while daily rituals structured every moment. To outsiders, even high-ranking officials, the emperor was an almost mythical figure seen only when he descended from the dragon throne for rare, highly choreographed audiences. Yet inside those walls, the balance of power was delicate. Eunuchs, castrated servants taken as boys, often from poor families, were initially meant only to handle menial tasks and guard the inner gates. Over time, some proved adept at reading the emperor's moods or memorizing his preferences down to his favored tea blend or the particular way he liked his ceremonial robes folded. Friendly eunuchs became confidants. One such figure, Wang Ji, rose quickly by managing the emperor's private correspondence. Without official rank, he coordinated audience schedules, screened petitions, and discreetly advised on palace matters. His position allowed him to influence promotions in the ministries and shape which ministers might receive an imperial edict. Concubines, too, navigated a world of ritual strictness. In this era, the emperor had one officially recognized empress and several lower-ranked consorts. Their primary role, in theory, was to produce heirs, each bearing a potential political faction. The inner palace comprised 6 main residences where the empress and favored consorts lived, each courtyard carefully guarded and accessible only by eunuchs or senior handmaidens. An empress like Empress Wang, chosen by the Hongxi Emperor in 1424, oversaw daily worship rituals in the imperial ancestral temple and assisted with state ceremonies, yet rarely met the emperor without mediation. Lesser consorts, often daughters of regional officials, were brought into the inner court to strengthen alliances. Their families believed that if their daughter bore a prince, their clan's standing would rise. Even devotional practices carried political weight. Every morning before sunrise, the hall of mental cultivation would light oil lamps and incense. A favored consort, Lady Li, would stand before her embroidered screen to lead a brief chant alongside palace maids. Her voice, praised for its clarity, caught the emperor's attention, leading to morning audiences where she could subtly promote her family's interests. At the Hall of Supreme Harmony during the winter solstice ceremony, the empress would present offerings of jade and cooked millet, symbolizing her role as ritual intermediary. If she faltered, mispronouncing a verse or forgetting an incense offering, court historians noted it as inauspicious, a possible sign of declining fortune for the reigning house. In this era, ritual perfection and inner court hierarchy were inseparable. The more precisely one performed daily rites, the more influence one could wield. Qing Dynasty Court Intrigue in Empress Dowagers, 1644 to 1908. Fast forward 2 centuries to the Qing Dynasty. The Manchu conquerors understood the Forbidden City's symbolic power and preserved its layout, but they layered on Manchu customs and new power dynamics. In this era, the emperor's inner world became even more insular. The Kanshi Emperor R. 1661 to 1722 and his successors rarely left the palace grounds. Rival factions coalesced around competing kings or princes. Eunuchs, once simple servants, expanded into a formidable network of palace spies, relaying information to both the emperor and favored consorts. The Eastern Depot, under eunuch oversight, evolved into a surveillance agency that intercepted letters and monitored palace maids, ensuring that no private conversation went unheard. One standout figure was Empress Dowager Cixi (1835 to 1908), the most powerful woman in China's late imperial history. Entering the inner court as a low-ranking concubine of the Xianfeng Emperor, she bore his only surviving son. When the emperor died in 1861, an 8-year-old boy, Tongji, ascended the throne. Cixi moved swiftly alongside Empress Dowager Xian. She executed a palace coup known as the Xinyo coup, eliminating rivals and securing regency powers. From behind her screen in the Hall of Mental Cultivation, she manipulated court appointments, issued edicts, and secretly handled state affairs, often referring to them as instructions from the late emperor, all while maintaining the outward illusion of confined, ceremonial life. As regent, Cixi's influence extended deep into the inner court's daily fabric. She restructured the hierarchy of concubines, elevating her allies, demoting her adversaries, and assigning loyal eunuchs to serve as her eyes and ears. Each day began with her ritual bath at a small courtyard known as the Pool of Purity, performed by selected palace maids. This act became both spiritual cleansing and a demonstration of her supreme status. On feast days, Cixi presided over banquets in small side palaces, sampling delicate dishes, bird's nest soup, sugar-preserved cherries, and using these menus to signal her favor to certain chefs and kitchen eunuchs. Under her watch, the inner court became an arena of silent warfare. A gesture of a fan, a carefully concealed smile, or a passing comment in Manchu could shift an official's fortunes overnight. By the late 19th century, palace intrigue reached new heights. In 1900, when foreign troops occupied Beijing during the Boxer Rebellion, Cixi fled to Xi'an, leaving the palace vulnerable. Upon her return in 1902, she discovered that some eunuchs had hoarded treasures while others had used the palace's confined chaos to forge false imperial seals. In response, Cixi instituted sweeping purges. Over 3,000 eunuchs were dismissed or executed, and countless concubines were reassigned. Yet she could not fully suppress the growing whisper that the inner court's rituals, such as the annual incense ceremonies, had become empty performances masking an empire teetering on collapse. This era showed how court intrigue, ritual pageantry, and isolated decision-making in the inner palace could both consolidate and undermine power, ultimately leading to the dynasty's fall. Across these arises a central question: when does the pursuit of ritual perfection and inner court influence bolster imperial authority, and when does it isolate rulers from reality, paving the way for collapse? In the early Ming period, careful observance of rites and strategic alliances with eunuchs and consorts helped emperors secure loyalty and project cosmic order. But those same rituals, daily chanting, precise bowing protocols, and intricate palace hierarchies created a barrier between the emperor and pressing state matters. Reports from border provinces, famines, and peasant unrest were often delayed or filtered through layers of palace personnel. In the Qing period, Empress Dowager Cixi's mastery of inner court ritual and intrigue granted her decades of control. Yet her seclusion and the resulting echo chamber of palace advisors left her blindsided by nationalist movements and foreign threats, accelerating the dynasty's demise. The dilemma thus becomes clear: maintaining the aura of divine authority through inner court ritual can reinforce power, but it risks creating an elitist bubble detached from the empire's real challenges, undermining long-term stability. Era 1. Factional battles and eunuch dominance, 1500 to 1644. As the Ming dynasty progressed, the inner court's atmosphere grew increasingly competitive. Powerful eunuch families, having served multiple emperors, accumulated land, wealth, and influence. By the 16th century, figures like Wei Zhangxian (1568 to 1627), a eunuch who dominated the late Ming court, exemplified how eunuchs could eclipse official ministries. When the Tianqi Emperor R. 1620 to 1627, known for his disinterest in state affairs, entrusted Wei Zhangxian with vast authority, the eunuch manipulated appointments, suppressed dissenting literati, and formed the notorious Donlin Purge, imprisoning and executing dozens of Confucian scholars. Meanwhile, consort factions vied for ascendancy. The favorite concubine of the Jiajing Emperor are 1522 to 1567, Lady Yin, bore a son and temporarily displaced the empress, only to be executed later on accusations of witchcraft. Her demise sent tremors through the palace. Any hint of sorcery or favor could mean survival or death. During the Wanli Emperor's reign, r. 1572 to 1620, the emperor withdrew from governance for nearly 2 decades, entrusting eunuchs to handle court affairs. Power vacuums widened, and clerks in the inner court, once mere record keepers, began altering memorials to emphasize or downplay crises. Corrupt eunuchs enriched themselves by selling official positions to the highest bidder, prompting public outrage and fueling peasant rebellions that would ultimately contribute to the Ming's collapse in 1644. Empress Dowager role and the eclipse of imperial authority, 1661 to 1912. Following the Manchu conquest, the Qing dynasty retained many Ming court structures but added Manchu customs. Empress Dowager Xiaozhuan, 1613 to 1688, initially supported her young grandson, the Kanshi Emperor, teaching him Manchu language and etiquette. Under her guidance, the court balanced Manchu tribal heritage with Chinese bureaucratic systems. Yet by the late Qing, the inner court's power struggles took on new forms. Concubine factions jockeyed for the favor of ailing emperors. In 1850, when the Sanfeng Emperor died, Cixi, initially a lower-ranked concubine, collaborated with Prince Gong to outmaneuver senior consorts and secure her son's succession. This alliance set a precedent. Empress dowagers would henceforth wield real political power while emperors served figurehead roles. By the turn of the 20th century, Cixi's role exemplified how the inner court could become the true seat of power. Conservative ministers urged her to resist foreign encroachment, reformers pushed for modernization. Cixi initially supported the Hundred Days Reform, 1898, to build railroads and modernize the military, but her inner court advisors, sacred eunuchs, and elite consorts persuaded her to reverse course, fearing loss of traditional authority. The resulting purge of reformers and the return to reactionary policies accelerated national decline. When Hui finally abdicated in 1912, no one in the palace could muster a defense. The once invincible inner court, woven with ritual, intrigue, and familial alliances, ended as a relic of a bygone world. These converge on a pivotal question: can the inner court's combination of ritual, secrecy, and personal loyalty ever produce sustainable governance, or does it inevitably breed factionalism and blind spots? In the late Ming period, reliance on eunuch networks and consort favoritism gave individuals like Wei Zhongxian immense power but destabilized central control, contributing to the dynasty's downfall. In the Qing era, Empress Dowager Cixi's regency reaffirmed her position as the empire's guardian, yet her inner circle's caution and secrecy prevented necessary reforms, hastening collapse. The dilemma illustrates that while the inner court's rituals and personal ties can unify power around the throne, they also risk insulating rulers from broader realities, leading to poor decisions that reverberate across an entire empire. From empire to exhibition, the Forbidden City's transformation and modern relevance. Era 1. Imperial abdication and early Republican transition, 1912 to 1949. In 1912, as the gates of the Forbidden City closed to imperial rule, a tumultuous era began. The last emperor, Hui, officially abdicated yet remained within the palace under a peculiar arrangement. For the next year, he continued living in the inner court, his authority reduced to little more than ceremonial presence. Courtiers in worn robes shuffled through corridors once resplendent with gilded beams, unsure whether to bow in deference or greet the new Republican officials. The palace's vast courtyards, once filled with rhythmic processions of mandarins and eunuchs, grew quiet. When Hui finally left in 1924, escorted by a Republican warlord, the Forbidden City transformed from a seat of absolute rule into an uneasy relic of a bygone era. Republican leaders debated its fate, some saw it as an imperial taint to be erased, others recognized its cultural value. By 1925, the Palace Museum was established, converting imperial living quarters into exhibition halls. Early curators, many former palace officials trained in both classical scholarship and modern museology, cataloged treasures, bronze censers, silk robes embroidered with dragons, and intricate scrolls of court paintings. They faced daunting tasks, consolidating artifacts seized during the 1911 revolution, negotiating with Japanese occupiers during World War II to safeguard valuable scrolls, and cataloging everything from jade seals to ceremonial banners in makeshift warehouses. This era saw the Forbidden City's tentative rebirth as a public institution. Visitors, initially government officials, foreign diplomats, and selected scholars, wandered through the serene courtyards and shrine-lined halls. The shift from restricted palace to museum came with practical challenges. Many halls lacked electricity, so curators relied on lanterns or natural light to display porcelain vases and ornate furniture. Security was minimal, and during the Japanese occupation, 1937 to 1945, diplomats negotiated secretly to smuggle key relics to safety, fearing looting. Nevertheless, by the late 1940s, the Palace Museum built a reputation for preserving China's imperial heritage even as civil war raged just beyond the Red Walls. People's Republic Stewardship and Global Spotlight, 1949, present. With the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, the Forbidden City's role shifted again. The new communist government recognized its value as a national treasure and reopened it to mass audiences. Yet the museum's leadership now navigated ideological scrutiny. Imperial opulence conflicted with the communist ideal of egalitarianism. Initial policies labeled the Palace Museum as feudal remnants, and parts of it were repurposed for storage or offices. During the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976, Red Guards vandalized some antiquities, defaced halls, and attempted to destroy symbols of old China. Curators and palace staff quietly hid removable paintings and scrolls in underground vaults, saving countless artifacts from destruction. By the 1980s, as China opened to the world, the Forbidden City regained its status as a premier heritage site. Under the stewardship of the Palace Museum's director, Hu Jiqing, a massive restoration program began. Roof tiles were replaced, wooden beams reinforced, and ancient murals painstakingly retouched. Technicians used infrared scanners to detect hidden moisture in stone foundations. Conservators blended traditional lacquer techniques with modern chemical stabilizers to preserve wooden pillars. In 1987, the Forbidden City was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, placing it on the global stage and drawing international funding for restoration. Today, the Palace Museum welcomes over 15 million visitors a year, making it the world's most visited museum. Audio guides in multiple languages lead crowds through the Meridian Gate, past the grand halls where emperors once held court, and into secluded chambers where consorts danced on silk carpets. Virtual reality tours allow people across the globe to walk through the Hall of Supreme Harmony or explore the inner court's hidden pavilions. Modern exhibitions, such as a recent display of Qianlong-era jade carvings, draw long lines, while educational programs invite students to study calligraphy techniques once taught only to imperial scribes. High-tech climate controls protect delicate scrolls from humidity, and digital databases enable scholars to research artifacts remotely. Through those emerges a central question: how do we honor the Forbidden City's imperial legacy while making it relevant and accessible to a modern public? In the early Republican period, curators aimed to preserve artifacts and open access to select visitors, yet the new identity of museum sometimes felt at odds with the palace's original purpose as an exclusive imperial domain. When Puyi's chambers were converted to exhibition space, visitors could glimpse the bedchamber of the last emperor, an intimate window into solitude and power. Yet some traditionalists lamented the loss of privacy, arguing that certain halls should remain off-limits, reserved for scholarly study rather than public display. In the People's Republic era, the dilemma sharpened: should the palace retain its grandeur, complete with gilded roofs and ceremonial gates, or should parts of it be repurposed to reflect socialist values, perhaps housing proletarian art or serving as community spaces? During the Cultural Revolution, hardliners argued for erasing feudal symbols, leading to attacks on priceless artifacts. Afterward, the Palace Museum faced the opposite challenge. Too much reverence risked turning the palace into an ivory tower, a museum for tourists rather than a space for meaningful engagement. As modern museum practices emphasize visitor experience and interactive learning, the Forbidden City must balance meticulous restoration of ancient halls with accommodating millions, installing signage, providing rest areas, and controlling foot traffic to avoid damage. The dilemma thus revolves around tension between preserving authenticity, original wood, stone, and pigments, and adapting the space for today's global audience. Era 1. Preservation under Adversity, 1950 to 1980. During the 1950s and 1960s, the Palace Museum underwent intermittent restoration efforts, even as nationwide campaigns discouraged feudal culture. A small team of curators, led by Zhang Jifu, worked clandestinely to protect imperial treasures. When winter snows sealed pathways, these curators loaded lacquered cabinets with porcelain shards onto sleds, dragging them to hidden basements. Wooden beams with termite damage received emergency injections of resins, walls were insulated against leaks, and artisans repaired gilded rooftop decorations using only traditional pigments. However, the Cultural Revolution posed a dire threat. Red Guards, inflamed by ideological zeal, stormed through courtyards, smashing stone lions and defacing murals. Many of the excavations and labors of previous decades seemed at risk of complete wipeout. Curators responded by burying rare scrolls in salted clay within sealed compartments beneath the hull of preserving harmony. They misled inspectors by labeling boxes paper awaiting permissible disposal, a ruse that kept priceless items intact. By late 1976, after the fervor subsided, restoration teams emerged from hiding, unearthing crates of hidden artifacts. Though some items, like a Chinera book on palace horticulture, had gone missing, the majority of core collections survived. During this era, the Palace Museum's survival hinged on quiet, determined action from a few dedicated individuals who believed that the Forbidden City's treasures belonged not just to emperors but to future generations. Their efforts laid the groundwork for later comprehensive restorations. The contrast between deliberate destruction and clandestine preservation highlights an era in which the Forbidden City narrowly avoided irreversible loss. Modernization and cultural diplomacy, 1990-present. Beginning in the 1990s, global interest in China's heritage surged. With economic reforms and eased political tensions, the Palace Museum became a centerpiece of cultural diplomacy. In 2005, a groundbreaking exhibition titled Treasures of the Forbidden City toured museums in San Francisco, New York, and London. Over 300 pieces, ceramics, scrolls, imperial robes traveled under strict conditions, climate-controlled crates, round-the-clock security, and on-site conservators. Western audiences crowded into exhibition halls to see the ornate enamel work of Emperor Qianlong's tea set and witness the legendary jade that inspired scholar poets for centuries. At home, modernization efforts sought to enhance visitor experience without compromising historical integrity. In 2010, curators introduced interactive digital kiosks in 4 languages, allowing visitors to zoom into high-resolution images of fine brushwork on ancient scrolls. QR codes at select pavilions linked to augmented reality apps, enabling users to visualize the palace's appearance at different points in history, Ming, Qing, and early Republican. Elevated walkways guided foot traffic along designated routes, preventing wear on rare marble floors. Solar panels discreetly installed atop service buildings powered lighting in peripheral courtyards. Educational programs blossomed. The Youth in the Forbidden City Summer Camp invites middle school students to learn traditional crafts, calligraphy, porcelain painting, while studying palace architecture. Scholars collaborate internationally through digital archives, applying machine learning algorithms to decipher faded manuscripts and trace provenance. During the 2018 renovation of the Hall of Supreme Harmony, conservators used specialized scaffolding systems to avoid contact with restored roof beams, employing 3D modeling to plan efficient repairs. Yet modernization brings its own challenges: how to integrate fire safety without installing obtrusive sprinklers, how to expand visitor amenities, cafes, restrooms, without altering the palace's historic footprint. The solution has been subtle: restroom entrances disguised within existing service buildings, fans installed using existing ventilation ducts, and signage designed to blend with traditional architectural patterns. These innovations illustrate a modern era where technology and tradition coexist, ensuring the Forbidden City remains a living museum that honors the past while engaging a global, digitally savvy public. Across these lies a pressing question: can the Forbidden City maintain its historical authenticity while embracing the demands of modern tourism and digital engagement? In the early post-imperial era, preservation meant hiding artifacts and repelling ideological fervor at great risk and personal cost. Modern efforts, by contrast, focus on accessibility, using digital tools to bring the palace's wonders to anyone with an internet connection. Yet every new display case, every rooftop repair, and every digital kiosk risks altering the palace's once untouched spaces. The dilemma is clear: how do curators and policymakers preserve the Forbidden City's aura of antiquity, its moonlit courtyards, original knockoff points on ancient doors, while ensuring that millions of visitors can experience those very features without destroying them? When a contemporary family visits and snaps selfies in front of the Hall of Supreme Harmony, they expect clear walkways and safety barriers, elements unthinkable in 1420 but essential in 2021. Conversely, purists argue that too many safety railings and signage distract from the authenticity, turning sacred halls into theme park attractions. Striking that balance, preserving the city's soul while opening its heart to the world, remains the core challenge of this modern era. Over centuries of conquest, revolution, and renewal, the Forbidden City has evolved from an imperial fortress to a global cultural icon. We have seen how curators braved ideological storms to protect its treasures, how modern restorations combined ancient craftsmanship with cutting-edge technology, and how digital platforms now carry its stories beyond Beijing's red walls. Yet the palace endures not merely as a static monument but as a dynamic crucible of history where past and present, tradition and innovation converge. As you stroll through its shaded corridors, remember that each step traces centuries of human endeavor: the architect's measured stroke, the artisan's delicate glaze, the curator's careful catalog, and today, the digital archivist's keystrokes. With that, our journey through the 12 chapters concludes. May the lessons of the Forbidden City about balance, preservation, and adaptation echo in every corner of your own world, reminding us that heritage, once brought into the present, inspires the path forward.